Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Bloody footprints on the beach of Alabama. The sun had barely risen over the horizon as I stepped onto the soft sands of Alabama's coastline. The beach was quiet, empty, save for the occasional cry of a distant seagull. I had come to escape quiet time away from the bustling city life. But the moment I set foot on the beach, I knew something wasn't right. It wasn't just the stillness, though that was unsettling enough. No, it was something more. Something that prickled at the back of my mind. As I walked along the water's edge, the sight of dark, crimson footprints caught my attention. They weren't animal tracks. These were too large, too deliberate. The blood was fresh, and the imprints in the sand led toward the water, disappearing just shy of where the waves met the shore. At first, I thought it might be some kind of sick joke. Maybe some prankster had been out here the night before. But the chill that ran down my spine told me otherwise. There was something about the way the blood soaked into the sand, the way the tracks seemed to disappear into the water as if inviting me to follow, that felt wrong. The air itself had changed. It was thick, heavier somehow. I hesitated. The wind picked up, rustling the nearby palm trees. The waves lapped at the shore rhythmically, but in that moment, the sound felt oppressive, like the water was trying to speak, to warn me of something. I could hear my heart thudding in my chest, as if it too knew what I was thinking. But curiosity, that relentless, all-consuming force, pushed me forward. I took a step closer to the bloody footprints. The smell of salt water mingled with something else now, a metallic scent that made my stomach turn. Another step. Then another. Each time my foot landed, the sand seemed to give way beneath me, as though the beach itself was swallowing me, pulling me deeper into its grip. The footprints continued, leading straight toward the water. I knelt down, inspecting them more closely. The blood had formed jagged edges around the prints, as though the person, or whatever it was, had been dragging something behind them. I tried to make sense of it, my mind racing to rationalize what I was seeing. But there was no reasonable explanation. Only one thought screamed in my head. I wasn't alone. A sudden, sharp chill swept over me, the temperature dropping so quickly that I could see my breath misting in the cold air. My muscles tensed, as if they were preparing to flee, but my feet refused to move. I was rooted to the spot. And then, the first wave crashed against the shore. But it wasn't like any other wave I had seen before. This one was darker, almost black, as if the ocean itself had been tainted by whatever had left the bloody trail. It surged forward with unnatural force, foaming with a frothy red tinge. As the wave receded, I thought I saw something, or someone, moving just beneath the surface. I couldn't make it out clearly, but the shape, long and sinuous, sent a wave of fear crashing over me. My breath caught in my throat. The footprints, once faint, were now vivid, as if the blood itself had been calling me forward. They seemed to pulse, to beckon me to come closer. A voice, or something like it, echoed through my mind. Come closer. See for yourself. But the closer I got, the more my instincts screamed at me to stop. The air was thick now, heavy with the scent of decay, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. Every fiber of my being told me to run, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, my eyes locked on the spot where the footprints disappeared into the dark waters. For a moment, I thought I heard something, a soft rustling, the sound of something shifting beneath the surface of the water. But when I looked, there was nothing. And then, I felt it. A coldness at my back, a presence just behind me, as if something had materialized from the shadows. My heart pounded in my chest, and my legs trembled. My body screamed for me to turn and flee, but I couldn't. Was it just the wind? Or something else? A voice, whispering just behind me, sent chills crawling up my spine. Don't turn around. But I did. And that's when I saw it. From the dark depths of the water, a shape emerged. At first, it was just a silhouette, barely visible against the churning waves. But then, it took form, tall, with a long, twisted body that seemed to writhe in the water like some grotesque creature. Its eyes glowed, red, like embers, burning with an unnatural hunger. It was staring at me. I stumbled backward, my feet slipping in the wet sand. My heart raced, every instinct screaming for me to escape, but I was paralyzed by fear. The creature in the water moved toward me, its eyes never leaving mine. It was as if it was drawing me in, pulling me closer to it with every step. I had to leave. I had to get away. But then, the ground beneath me began to tremble. The beach, once calm and quiet, now seemed to be alive with the sounds of cracking wood and the splashing of the waves as they grew stronger. The air was thick with the scent of blood, and the blood-red footprints in the sand were no longer fading away. They were growing, spreading, as though the creature's presence was carving its mark into the very earth itself. I took one last, terrified look at the thing in the water. Its eyes glowed brighter now, almost blinding, and its shape was becoming clearer, long, sinewy, with arms that seemed to stretch toward me, impossibly long. But it wasn't just its eyes that haunted me. It was the sound, the low, rasping growl that seemed to come from deep within the water, like some ancient, unseen predator. The growl was a warning. It wasn't just watching me. It was hunting me. And that's when I realized the truth. I was never meant to leave this beach. I turned. The sand beneath my feet felt heavy, almost as if it were trying to hold me in place, to prevent my escape. The coldness in the air seemed to deepen, wrapping around my chest, squeezing tighter with every panicked breath. I couldn't escape. Not yet. Not until I knew what was happening here. I took another step back, trying to steady myself, but the tremor in my legs betrayed me. The world seemed to be closing in, silent, but with an oppressive weight. The creature, thing, that had risen from the water continued to watch me with those glowing red eyes. And the waves, as if under its control, crashed violently against the shore, sending salty spray into the air. I had to think. I had to do something. Running wasn't an option. If I turned my back now, I'd be as good as dead. But standing here, frozen in place, wasn't getting me anywhere either. I glanced toward the shore. My bag, my phone, my shoes, everything I had brought with me had been left on the sand when I started following the trail. Panic clawed at my throat. I needed help. I needed to call someone. But I knew deep down that no one would make it in time. There was no way to explain this horror. Why me? I couldn't stop thinking. What was I doing here? What had I walked into? I forced myself to breathe slowly, to calm my racing thoughts. The creature in the water hadn't moved yet. I still had time. I just needed to think, to make the right decision. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't stay in the open, but to leave would mean getting farther from help. And who knew what else this thing could do? Then, the sound came again, the soft rustling beneath the surface of the water, like something moving just below, waiting for its moment to strike. The growl had intensified, deepened, as though it was coming from the very ocean itself. I tried to rationalize. Maybe it wasn't real. Maybe I was hallucinating, maybe the heat of the day or dehydration had gotten to me. But as I stood there, my body shaking, I knew deep inside that wasn't true. This wasn't some fevered vision. The thing in the water was real. And it was coming closer. The blood-stained footprints seemed to pulse, as though they were alive, beckoning, urging me toward the water. The air felt thick, suffocating. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the creature. It shifted, its long limbs moving gracefully beneath the water, the glow of its eyes intensifying. It wasn't waiting for me to approach. It was waiting for me to make a mistake. I thought about running, but the path behind me seemed more dangerous than the one ahead. The sand shifted beneath me again, like something was pressing up from below. My heartbeat echoed in my ears as I stumbled backward, almost falling. Suddenly, I heard a soft clicking, faint at first, but growing louder with every passing second. It was coming from the direction of the footprints. I dared not look, but I knew the sound all too well, the gnawing, the chittering of teeth, the unmistakable sound of something hungry. It was as if the beach itself had come alive with the sounds of these creatures, whatever they were, lurking just beneath the surface, hidden in the sand, in the shadows. I had to move. Without thinking, I turned and ran away from the water, away from the creature, towards the dunes, towards what little safety I hoped I could find. My feet were unsteady on the soft sand, my legs burning as I pushed forward. But the moment I turned away from the ocean, I heard it. A splash. A long, wet, horrible sound. And then the unmistakable thud of something heavy landing on the shore behind me. I dared not look. The ground seemed to tremble under my feet as the things began to emerge from the water. Shadows, grotesque shapes, writhing, undulating figures that seemed to stretch impossibly tall. Their eyes glowed, red and malevolent, piercing through the darkness. Their long, bony hands reached toward me, their claws clicking against the sand like the tapping of a death march. I kept running. My breath was ragged, my mind scrambling for a way out. The sounds of the creatures, growing louder with each step, chased me, echoing in the silence of the beach, their movements erratic and unnatural. The clicking and hissing grew louder, reverberating through the air. Then came the whisper again, close and chilling. "You can't outrun us." I stumbled and fell, landing hard on the sand. My body screamed in pain, but I had no time to recover. I had no time for anything. The creatures were almost upon me, their hands, now unmistakably visible, reaching for me, their long fingers curling with predatory intent. But then, just as I thought they would grab me, a sudden flash of light tore through the darkness, blinding and powerful. The ground shook once more, a roar that rumbled through the earth itself, the sound of something ancient awakening from its slumber. The creatures recoiled, their glowing eyes narrowing as they hissed in unison, retreating back into the water. But I didn't stop running. I couldn't. I didn't care about the source of the light or why the creatures had withdrawn. I just knew that, for the moment, I was safe. Or so I thought. Because when I looked up, I saw it. The last thing I would ever see on that beach. The thing that had been watching me from the depths of the water. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't a creature at all. It was a reflection. a reflection of me. In the water, I saw my own face, twisted, contorted with terror, but there was something wrong with it. It was still, frozen in the image of a person who had already given up. A person who had already been consumed. And then the water began to rise. I was already too late. The roar of the water crashing against the shore grew deafening. The waves didn't just break against the sand, they rose, pushing higher, as if the ocean itself was angry, thrashing, seeking vengeance. My body froze, a deep, instinctual terror gnawing at my insides. My thoughts were a blur, a jumble of confusion and fear. What was happening? What was that reflection? Was it me, or something else that had taken my place? I stumbled back, heart pounding in my chest, my feet struggling to find solid ground on the shifting sand. The light, the flash that had pushed the creatures back, flickered and then went out. The beach, once bathed in the bright glow of the moon, was now swallowed by darkness. A thick, oppressive blackness that pressed against me, making it difficult to breathe. I couldn't think anymore. All I could do was run from the rising water, from the horrible truth that something was waiting for me. But as I turned to flee, my foot slipped in the sand, and I tumbled to the ground, scraping my hands and knees against the jagged rocks. The pain was sharp, but it barely registered. My pulse roared in my ears, drowning out everything else. The sound of water sloshing behind me grew closer. The clicking, that terrible clicking sound, was now mixed with something else, a wet, slithering noise that seemed to come from all directions. I was surrounded. No. I couldn't accept it. I couldn't. There had to be a way out. But I didn't know where to go. The beach stretched on forever in both directions, and the creatures, those things, were closing in from the ocean and the shore. There was nowhere left to run. I turned, desperate, my eyes scanning the horizon for something, anything, that could save me. But all I saw was the water, rising higher, its surface dark and still, like a silent, watching predator. My mind raced, searching for a way to explain this. I tried to rationalize again, telling myself it couldn't be real. That I must be dreaming, that I'd fall asleep and wake up somewhere safe. But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't a dream. Something was happening here. Something far worse than I could comprehend. And it was happening now. The ground beneath me trembled again, and I heard the distinct sound of something moving through the sand. It was behind me, something huge, something massive, clawing its way toward me. I couldn't see it, but I could hear its movement, feel it in the air, in the ground beneath my feet. I looked over my shoulder, and there it was. A shadow, vast and menacing, its form distorted and blurry, like a dark stain creeping across the beach. For a moment, I thought it was just my imagination, but then the shadow shifted, and the shape became clearer. It wasn't just one creature. It was a swarm. A horde. Thousands of them, crawling, slithering across the beach, their glowing eyes shining like coals in the night, their sharp claws scraping against the rocks. The sound of their movement was like 1,000 rats skittering across the floor, scratching, biting, clawing, whispering in some language I could never understand. I backed away, stumbling over the rocks, desperate to escape. But they were everywhere. Everywhere. The swarm had surrounded me, their eyes burning with malice, their movements synchronized, as though they were all part of one mind. Then, just as I thought I might be torn apart, the world seemed to stop. Time seemed to stretch, becoming slow, drawn out, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. And in that moment, I saw it. The creature, the one that had first risen from the water, emerged once again, dragging itself onto the shore. It wasn't like the others. It was larger, its form towering over me, its eyes glowing bright red, seething with an ancient rage. Its long, twisted limbs scraped against the ground as it approached, and its mouth opened wide in a grotesque, gaping maw. I froze. The air grew colder still, the oppressive weight of it pressing on my chest, choking me. I could feel its gaze upon me, like it was seeing right into my soul, knowing everything about me. Knowing my fear. My helplessness. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't obey. The paralysis of fear was overwhelming, a suffocating cloud wrapping around my body, holding me still. And then I heard it. A whisper. Low. Dark. You shouldn't have come. I wanted to scream, to fight, to break free. But the words came out as nothing more than a whimper, lost in the wind. Suddenly, the ground beneath me shifted, and a massive wave crashed against the shore, flooding the beach, dragging everything into the water, the sand, the rocks, the creatures, and me. The last thing I saw was the red glow of its eyes, and the creatures closing in, their jaws snapping with hunger. The water rose higher. I was pulled under. The world went black. And then, nothing. I woke with a gasp, my lungs burning as if I had been drowning. My heart was racing, a frantic drumbeat in my chest, but when I opened my eyes, all I saw was darkness. Cold. My limbs were numb, like they belonged to someone else, and my body ached in ways I couldn't comprehend. My head throbbed, as though it had been struck, and my skin felt clammy, coated with something slick, something unnatural. I tried to move, but the paralysis, the weight of fear, clung to me. My fingers twitched, but the effort was too much. My surroundings were pitch black, and the air was thick, almost suffocating. I could hear nothing but the sound of my ragged breathing, my pulse hammering in my ears. Was I dead? I didn't want to believe it. I had to fight. I had to get up. Slowly, inch by inch, I forced my body to move, pushing through the overwhelming heaviness that gripped me. The cold air felt like it was sucking the life out of me, but I managed to sit up, blinking in confusion as my eyes adjusted to the dark. I was in some sort of narrow space, damp, claustrophobic. My thoughts were a mess, like trying to remember a dream that was slipping through my fingers. Where was I? How had I gotten here? The last thing I remembered was being dragged beneath the water, the creature's eyes closing in, the world going dark. And now I was in some cold, confined place. I reached out with trembling hands, trying to find something solid, something real. My fingers brushed against stone. Cold, slick stone. I wasn't at the beach anymore. This wasn't the shore. I shuddered. The reality of my situation was crashing in on me. I wasn't safe. But where was I? And what had happened to those things? The swarm, the giant creature. Had I really escaped? A groan escaped my lips as I pushed myself up. My legs shook, and the moment I stood, my head spun, the world around me swaying. I had no idea how long I'd been unconscious. Minutes? Hours? Days? But something was wrong. The air felt different here, heavier, thick with dampness, as though I was deep underground. The stone walls around me pressed in, the space feeling smaller, more suffocating the longer I stayed still. I took a step forward, then another. My steps echoed through the void, soft at first, but soon I heard something else, another sound. A low, distant scraping like nails against stone. I froze. The sound, it was coming closer. Was it the creatures? Could they have followed me here? My pulse quickened. No, it couldn't be them. I had to think, had to move. But my body felt like it was made of lead, unwilling to obey. The scraping noise grew louder, faster, like something, or someone, was moving swiftly through the darkness toward me. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any noise. I stood there, my breath shallow, listening. Every muscle in my body tense, ready to spring into action, even if I had no idea what I was preparing for. The darkness around me felt alive, as if it was closing in. The air was thick with an unseen presence, something I couldn't quite place. Then, from somewhere deep within the shadows, I heard it. A voice. Soft. Whispers. Unclear. It was low, too low, barely a breath, but it seemed to come from every direction at once. It wasn't human. It was like a murmur, ancient and filled with hunger. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone, the tone, sent a chill down my spine. I took another step back, and my foot brushed something soft. A thick, wet substance slipped beneath my shoe. I looked down, heart leaping into my throat. There, spread across the floor, was a trail of dark, viscous liquid. I knelt to examine it, but my hands trembled too. Much to touch it. The smell was rancid, a mix of decay and salt, as if it had been there for a long time. What was this? I stood up quickly, panic rising in my chest. The scraping noise had returned, closer now, and the whispers, the voice was louder, more insistent. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but I felt the oppressive weight of it bearing down on me. The air itself seemed to press against my skin, tightening, suffocating. Suddenly, a sound pierced the darkness, louder now. A heavy thud. And then I saw it. A figure. Emerging from the shadows. It was humanoid, but distorted, its shape twisted, moving with a fluidity that no human should possess. The thing seemed to slither rather than walk, its body coiling unnaturally in the dark. Its eyes, those terrible eyes, glowed faintly in the pitch-black darkness, their brightness cutting through the gloom like twin fireflies. I took a step back, my body screaming in terror, but I was frozen in place. The creature advanced slowly, its form more defined now. Its skin was a sickly, mottled color, shifting like water under a full moon. Its mouth hung open, filled with rows of jagged, sharp teeth. The air around it seemed to warp, and its movements were accompanied by the sound of something wet slithering across the stone floor. This can't be real, I thought. It can't be. But it was. The creature stopped in front of me, its eyes locking with mine. I could feel its gaze piercing into my soul, an unbearable weight. It was waiting, watching, as if it was measuring my fear. And then it spoke. You should have never tried to escape. The words sent a shock through me. I stumbled back, my mind racing. What was it? What did it want from me? The creature's lips curled into something resembling a smile, though it was more of a sneer. It seemed to revel in my terror, its eyes burning brighter with each passing second. It began to move again, faster now, and I felt my body react before my mind could catch up. I ran. I ran with everything I had left. My legs burned with effort as I stumbled through the darkness, my hands slamming against the cold, rough walls as I tried to orient myself. The creature was behind me, its slithering movements growing louder with each passing second. Its voice echoed in my mind, "You should have never tried to escape." The words felt like chains, wrapping tighter around my chest, making it harder to breathe. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't think. I could only run. The narrow passage seemed endless. My footfalls rang out, the sound of my own terror amplified in the suffocating dark. Every breath I took was ragged, each inhale feeling more like an attempt to suck in the very life I was desperately trying to cling to. The shadows around me shifted, as if the walls themselves were alive, pressing in from all sides. The air grew colder, sharper, as if the very temperature was shifting to match the terror that clutched at my heart. I could feel it now. There was something else in the dark, something moving just beyond the edges of my vision. I glanced over my shoulder. The creature was close, too close. I couldn't outrun it. It was going to catch me. Panic surged through me, and I made a desperate turn into a smaller tunnel, hoping that it might provide a way out. The walls constricted, narrowing until the passage barely allowed me to squeeze through. But I had no choice. I had to keep going. I had to survive. I could hear the creature now, closer than ever. Its breath was wet and labored, a horrible sound that seemed to come from all around me. I rounded another corner, but I was met with an obstacle, a dead end. My heart sank as I slammed into the wall, the cold stone shocking against my palms. I spun around, searching for another way out, but there was nothing. No way forward. No escape. The scraping noise grew louder. The voice, that low, mocking voice, taunted me from the darkness, sending a chill through my bones. "You should have never tried to escape," it repeated, the words now a chorus, a mockery of my fear. And then, I saw it. A flicker of movement. Something glinting in the dim light. I turned my head, desperate for anything that could help. My eyes locked onto the object, a rusted pipe protruding from the wall, just within reach. The pipe was jagged, sharp, its surface uneven and cruel. I didn't know why I thought of it, but I knew I had to act. I had no other choice. With trembling hands, I grabbed the pipe and yanked it free. The noise of it scraping against the stone echoed through the tunnel, and the creature paused. It was close. Too close. I backed into the corner, my breath shallow, my hands shaking as I gripped the pipe. I could feel the sweat beating on my forehead, my pulse in my throat. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the very walls of this place wanted to consume me. The creature appeared from the shadows, its eyes glowing brighter, its twisted form more defined now. I raised the pipe, but my hands felt weak, my arms trembling with exhaustion. The thing slithered toward me, a grotesque smile stretching across its face, sharp teeth glinting in the dark. It stopped just a few feet away, its glowing eyes locking onto mine. And for a moment, I thought it was going to speak again. But it didn't. Instead, it lunged. I swung the pipe with every ounce of strength I had left. It collided with the creature's face with a sickening crack, and for a moment, it seemed stunned, its glowing eyes flashing with surprise. I pushed harder, slamming the pipe against its skull again and again, not thinking, not caring. I had to survive. Finally, the creature let out a terrible screech, a sound so raw and piercing that it made my ears ring. It recoiled, its form flickering and warping as if it were losing its grip on reality. I didn't wait. I ran. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I sprinted through the tunnel, my mind a blur of panic and adrenaline. I could hear it following, its unnatural speed gaining on me, but I didn't care. The sound of its slithering movements only spurred me forward, urging me to move faster. I had to escape. I had to get out of this hellish place. And then, at last, I saw it, the faintest sliver of light at the end of the tunnel. Hope surged within me, pure and unfiltered. I pushed myself harder, faster, my legs burning with effort, my breath ragged in my throat. The light grew brighter with every step, the tunnel widening as I neared it. My heart pounded in my chest, my body trembling with exhaustion, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't slow down. The light was so close now. Just a few more steps. And then, just as I reached it, something grabbed my ankle. I screamed, my body jerking forward as I tried to pull away, but the grip was too strong. I twisted, kicking at the thing holding me, but it didn't let go. I tried to scream again, but the darkness was swallowing my voice, silencing me. I looked down. The creature's hand, no, its claw, was wrapped around my leg, its long, twisted fingers digging into my flesh. Its eyes glowed brighter, closer, its jagged teeth bared in a grin of satisfaction. "You should have never tried to escape," it whispered again, its voice echoing in the dark, the words wrapping around me like a suffocating noose. With one final, desperate cry, I pulled as hard as I could, my body lurching forward, the light just beyond my reach. But the darkness was stronger. And then, everything went black. The Whispering Meadow in Vermont. Have you ever been in a place so quiet that the silence seemed almost alive? I used to think the quietness of the Vermont woods was something peaceful, a way to escape the noise of everyday life. But what I found there wasn't peace. It was something else entirely. Something that should never be. I never expected a short weekend hike to change everything. I had heard the stories, of course, the whispers that floated through the air, the odd feeling that you weren't alone, even though you couldn't see anyone around. I figured it was just a product of overactive imaginations and wild tales spun by those who lived here. But then, I found the meadow. It was a small clearing nestled deep in the woods, hidden away from the usual trails. The trees arched high overhead, their thick branches weaving a canopy that barely let the sunlight through. I had wandered off the path a little, hoping to find some solitude, when I stumbled upon it. The meadow was unnaturally still, not a leaf stirred in the air, and the ground was soft underfoot, almost as if the earth itself was holding its breath. At first, I felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind that only nature can bring. But then, something changed. It was a sound, a soft whisper, like someone calling my name. "Emma." I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart skipping a beat. It wasn't loud. In fact, it was barely audible, almost lost in the wind. I looked around, scanning the trees, the rocks, the grass. Nothing. No one was there. Yet, the voice was clear, distinct, my name, calling out from somewhere deep within the meadow. "Emma." I swallowed, trying to shake off the creeping unease that began to take root in my chest. It had to be the wind, I told myself. Or maybe some animal in the woods, mimicking a human voice. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, a small voice in my head whispered that something wasn't right. I took a few cautious steps forward, my mind racing with possibilities. The whispering continued, faint at first, but growing louder as I moved deeper into the meadow. "Emma." I could almost feel the voice brushing against my skin, like a cool breath against my ear. It was as if the very air around me had come alive, wrapping itself around my senses, suffocating me with its eerie presence. I spun around, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was no one. Just trees. The shadows seemed to stretch longer now, darker somehow, and the silence that had once been so comforting now felt suffocating. I was alone, yet not alone. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of fear that was slowly clouding my thoughts. There was nothing here but the wind, just the wind. I had to be imagining things. But then, it happened again. This time, the voice was clearer. "Emma, come closer." I froze. My pulse quickened, my skin prickled with an icy chill. The voice seemed to come from the ground itself, seeping up through the grass and earth, as if the very meadow was alive and calling me. I wanted to turn and run, but my feet felt rooted to the spot, my body unwilling to obey the fear that was growing within me. "Come closer," it repeated, the voice now sounding almost familiar. I stepped backward, my heart thumping louder in my chest. But before I could move further, a cold wind swept through the meadow, stirring the long grass and sending a shiver down my spine. My name echoed once more, but this time it was different. The voice was no longer just a whisper, it was a command. "Emma, come." I turned and ran. My breath came in short, frantic gasps as I pushed through the thick underbrush, branches whipping at my face, scratching at my skin. The meadow, the whispering, it all felt like a trap, pulling me deeper into its grasp. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was behind me, watching me, following me. The shadows seemed to stretch toward me, reaching out with unseen hands. My legs burned with exhaustion, but I kept running, faster, harder, desperate to get away from the voices that now seemed to follow my every step. Then, as I burst out of the trees and into the open, the meadow behind me fell silent. The whispering stopped. I stood there for a moment, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The normal sounds of the forest returned, the distant calls of birds, the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Everything seemed normal again. But deep down, I knew that I had just escaped something I couldn't explain. The memory of the voice, the command, it haunted me as I made my way back down the path, my mind still reeling from what had happened. What was that place? What was that voice? And why had it called my name? As I left the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The feeling that something, or someone, was still watching me. And as I looked back toward the trees, I thought I saw something move in the shadows, a figure, just beyond the edge of my vision. But when I blinked, it was gone. The next few days felt like a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling that the whispering had followed me home, that something in the woods had imprinted itself on me. I tried to rationalize it, of course. I told myself it was just a trick of the wind, a sound carried by the breeze, some strange, isolated phenomenon that meant nothing. But deep down, I knew I wasn't being honest with myself. It wasn't just the whispering. It was the way the trees had seemed to close in on me as I ran. The way the shadows felt alive, stretching toward me with every step I took. I couldn't ignore the sensation that something was watching me, something that knew my name, that wanted me to return. I avoided the meadow for the rest of the week, but the pull to go back, to understand, gnawed at me. I couldn't explain why, but I felt like I had to go back. I had to know what it was, what I had felt out there in that meadow. Was I just imagining it? Or was there something more, something that lurked in the woods, something ancient and hidden? On the 6th day, after much internal debate, I decided to return. I tried to convince myself that it was a mistake, that I didn't need to go back. But as the day wore on, the unease I had felt during the first hike came back. It was like an itch in the back of my mind that couldn't be scratched. It was a combination of fear and curiosity, and it had a hold on me. When I arrived at the edge of the forest again, the trees were just as I remembered, dense, towering, like sentinels watching over the land. The air felt heavier this time, thicker, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. The meadow was further in, and I wasn't sure what I expected to find there, but the idea of walking back into that eerie silence made my stomach churn. Still, I pushed on. I couldn't just leave it like this. The path was familiar, but as I walked deeper into the woods, I started to notice small changes. The light seemed dimmer, the air cooler. The familiar sounds of the forest, birds, rustling leaves, were missing. The silence hung over the place like a thick fog, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. And then, I heard it. A whisper. It was faint at first, just like last time. "Emma." I froze, the blood draining from my face. The voice, low and calm, had returned. I didn't know why I thought it would be any different this time. But it wasn't the same. The voice wasn't just calling my name, it felt closer. As if it were right beside me, its presence surrounding me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a cold chill creep down my spine. My feet felt like they were glued to the ground, but my mind screamed at me to turn around and run. I ignored the instinct, trying to convince myself that I was being foolish, that it was all in my head. After all, I had to see it for myself, didn't I? I needed to understand what was happening. "Emma." The voice came again, but this time it didn't sound like a whisper. It sounded like it was inside my head. I swallowed hard and took a hesitant step forward. The ground beneath me seemed softer than before, as if it were swallowing my every movement. Every step I took felt like I was sinking deeper into something dark and heavy. But the whispering called me, urging me on. "Come closer." The voice was unmistakable now, clear, soft, but unmistakably insistent. I turned in the direction of the voice, my heart racing. I knew the meadow was ahead, but it was different now. It felt wrong, as if I was being drawn into a trap. The shadows in the trees stretched unnaturally, their forms twisting and shifting as I made my way forward. The path seemed to change, as if the woods were rearranging themselves to lead me deeper into the heart of the forest. The air grew colder, and a thin mist began to roll in from the trees, wrapping around my ankles like icy fingers. I should have turned back. I should have listened to that voice inside my head telling me to leave. But I couldn't. The pull of the meadow was too strong. When I finally reached the clearing, I saw it, the meadow. But it wasn't as it had been before. The sunlight was blocked entirely by thick, dark clouds overhead, and the grass had grown wild, untamed, curling and twisting as if it were reaching for something. The silence here was profound, oppressive. The wind had died completely, and the air felt like it was holding its breath. "Emma." The voice came again, but it wasn't just one voice anymore. It was many voices, overlapping, each one calling my name from a different direction. They sounded desperate, pleading, as if something, or someone, was trying to draw me in. I looked around frantically, trying to locate the source of the voices, but all I could see were the trees, the grass, and the darkening sky. Nothing was there. No one was there. But the voices grew louder. They weren't just calling my name now, they were repeating things I had said, things I had done. They echoed my thoughts, my memories, my fears. They knew me. And that realization, more than anything else, sent a cold shiver through my entire being. I tried to move, but my legs felt heavy, as though the earth itself were holding me in place. The whispering surrounded me now, louder, more urgent. The voices seemed to be closing in, and the ground beneath me seemed to shift, as if something was stirring underneath. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. Something was holding me there, something that knew my name, that knew my every fear, every weakness. And then, through the cacophony of voices, I heard something else, a rustling sound, followed by a thump. It was like something large and heavy was moving through the trees, and the sound was getting closer. I wasn't alone. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. The rustling in the trees grew louder, closer. I dared not turn my head to look, afraid that whatever it was would be there, staring right at me. The voices continued to call my name, now frenzied, desperate. They seemed to be everywhere, all around me, but I couldn't tell from where. "Emma, come closer, we're waiting for you." The ground beneath me trembled slightly, a soft vibration that sent a ripple of fear through my body. I wanted to scream, to run, but the air was thick, heavy, and it felt like I was trapped in a strange, oppressive force that refused to let me move. The rustling came again, louder this time, almost like footsteps, something large, something far too heavy to be an animal. It sounded as if it was moving just beyond the trees, circling, waiting. I finally managed to force my legs to move, but it was as though the meadow itself was resisting me, pulling me back. My feet felt like they were sinking into the soft earth with every step I took, as if the ground itself was trying to swallow me whole. I glanced nervously around, trying to spot anything that might explain what was happening. But the meadow was empty. There was nothing but the overgrown grass, the twisted trees, and the suffocating silence. Then I saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows of the trees at the far side of the meadow. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its shape was vague, almost like a distortion in the air itself. It was a shadow that shifted, warped, like it was trying to take form but couldn't quite manage it. The longer I looked, the more it seemed to melt and twist into something else, something I couldn't comprehend. I felt my blood run cold. The whispering reached a crescendo, all the voices coming together in a cacophony that shook me to my core. The figure in the shadows seemed to notice me, its shape wavered, then moved toward me, its presence unmistakable now. Every step it took was silent, but I could feel its weight, its dark energy pressing in on me from all sides. My legs finally obeyed, and I began to run, though every step felt like I was moving through thick mud. The meadow, which had once seemed so open and expansive, now felt suffocating, like the walls of the trees were closing in on me, trapping me in this horrible, twisted place. I didn't dare look back. The figure was behind me. I was certain of it. I could feel it, its dark presence growing closer with each frantic step I took. The whispering grew louder, now almost like a chant, chanting my name in eerie unison. "Emma, you can't escape, we're waiting for you." Panic surged through me as I pushed my legs harder, the fear now driving me faster. I had to get out. I had to get back to the safety of my car, back to the town where everything felt normal. But no matter how fast I ran, the meadow seemed to stretch on forever. The trees on the edge of the clearing seemed farther away now, as if the very forest was trying to keep me here, to keep me from leaving. Suddenly, the ground beneath me gave way, and I stumbled, falling to my knees in the soft earth. The mist was thickening now, wrapping around my body, chilling me to the bone. I could barely breathe, the air suffocating, like I was drowning in it. "Emma!" The voice was so close now, I could feel it against my skin, as if it was right next to me, whispering into my ear. I tried to scramble to my feet, but my body felt heavy, as if it was no longer my own. My limbs moved in slow motion, like I was trapped in a dream from which I couldn't wake. I could hear the rustling again, the sound of something moving through the trees. I knew it wasn't human. I knew that whatever it wasn't just watching me, it was hunting me. My eyes darted around, searching for any escape, but there was nothing. The meadow was closing in on me. The figure, now more defined but still shifting, was standing at the edge of the clearing, its form flickering like a bad signal on an old television screen. It was watching me, waiting. And I knew, without a doubt, that it wasn't alone. I felt the breath catch in my throat. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat loud enough to drown out the whispers. It was coming closer. A sudden flash of movement caught my eye. In the corner of the clearing, a massive shadow shifted, something so large it couldn't possibly be real. It moved with an unnatural grace, its body low to the ground, eyes gleaming in the dark. I could see them, two pairs of glowing eyes, red and hungry. Panic surged through me, and without thinking, I screamed, pushing myself to my feet and stumbling backward. My vision blurred as I spun around, desperate for an escape. But the forest was closing in, the trees reaching out with their twisted limbs, the ground giving way beneath me. I wasn't going to make it. I knew that now. And then, the voices stopped. A sudden, deafening silence fell over the meadow. Even the rustling stopped. I froze, trying to listen, trying to understand what was happening, but the air felt thick with the weight of what was to come. I heard one last whisper, soft and distant. "Come, we're waiting for you." The ground beneath me cracked open. And then, everything went black. When I regained consciousness, it wasn't the soft, humid air of the meadow that greeted me, but a thick, suffocating darkness. My head throbbed, my body aching as if I had been dragged across sharp rocks. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was, only that I had been running, and the fear, the overwhelming terror, had nearly consumed me. I blinked, trying to adjust to the pitch blackness. A faint, unnatural cold crept over my skin. I felt the ground beneath me, soft and damp, but it wasn't grass. It was something else. Mud. Clay. The air was thick with the smell of decay, something familiar, but I couldn't quite place it. Suddenly, a sound, faint at first, but growing louder. A low, guttural hum, vibrating through the earth beneath me. It felt like the hum was coming from all around me, as though the very ground itself was alive with something ancient, something that had been waiting for me. I moved to sit up, my hands trembling as I pressed them against the ground, only to find that the surface wasn't flat. It was uneven, rocky. I shifted my position, trying to stand, but my legs refused to cooperate. They felt like jelly, weak and unresponsive, as if they had been numbed by the very air I was breathing. I took a few shallow breaths, trying to calm my racing heart. Where was I? How had I gotten here? The answer came slowly, too slowly. I remembered the meadow, the whispers, the figures, and the eyes. The massive shadows in the trees. And the ground cracking beneath me, the moment everything went dark. I had fallen. But where? Where was I now? The air smelled of something rotten, something foul, and that was when I realized it. The smell wasn't just decay, it was death. Something had died here, and not just once. I tried to push myself to my feet again, panic surging through me, but I collapsed back down. The humming sound grew louder, vibrating through the walls of the darkness. It felt like the walls were closing in on me, squeezing the air from my lungs. I looked around, but there was nothing to see, only that suffocating blackness. Then, a noise, a shuffle, a scrape. It was coming from the distance. Slow, deliberate, like something moving through the shadows, dragging something heavy. My heart skipped a beat, my breath catching in my throat. The sound came closer, closer. And then, just as quickly, it stopped. I froze, listening, but there was only the hum now. The constant, unrelenting hum. And then, it happened. A voice. Soft, but unmistakable. "Emma." It whispered, a sound like a sigh, like a breath against my ear. "You're home now." I felt a jolt of terror shoot through me, my chest tightening. That voice. It was one of the voices I had heard in the meadow, the one that had been calling my name. I scrambled backwards, my hands scraping against the rough earth as I tried to push myself away from the sound, away from whatever was out there. But there was nowhere to go. I was surrounded by the endless blackness, the silence, and the hum that seemed to pulse in my veins. "Emma, you belong here," the voice said again, a little louder, a little more insistent. "You've always belonged here." I was gasping for breath now, panic swelling in my chest, and I realized there was no escape. The voices, the presence, the shadowy figures, they weren't just part of the meadow. They had followed me here, into this suffocating darkness. Into this place. A shift in the air. A movement. I turned my head quickly, but all I saw was blackness. The hum seemed to grow louder, more deafening, and suddenly the ground beneath me began to tremble, as though something was moving just beneath the surface. The earth gave way again, this time with a violent shake, and I felt my body being pulled down, sinking further, deeper, into the cold, wet ground. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was constricted, tight, as though the very air around me was choking me. And then, there it was. A shape. A figure. Slowly emerging from the darkness. Tall, thin, and twisted. A shadow, but this time it was clear, clearer than anything I had seen before. Its eyes glowed red, piercing through the blackness like burning embers. It was watching me, but not just watching, hunting. I tried to move, but my body was paralyzed, frozen in place. The hum grew louder still, now joined by another sound, a low growl, like something hungry, something waiting. And then the voice came again, whispering through the darkness. "You've come home, Emma. And now, you will stay." I felt the ground shift again, and before I could react, a wave of cold rushed over me. I was sinking, dragged downward by some invisible force. I opened my mouth to scream, but the earth filled it instead. It filled my lungs, my throat, my every pore. The last thing I saw were those glowing eyes, staring down at me as I was consumed by the dark. I woke again, if you could call it waking. My eyes fluttered open, but the world around me was still cloaked in an all-consuming blackness. I couldn't tell if I was still buried in the ground, if I was submerged in the earth, or if I was floating. My limbs felt weightless, numb. The only thing I could feel was the unmistakable presence of the air, thick, damp, and freezing. But there was something else now, something new, something more terrifying. A voice. It wasn't the whispering voice that had called my name, but something different. This voice was deeper, colder, and it seemed to echo from all directions. It vibrated in the very core of my being. "Do you feel it?" the voice asked. "The hunger?" My heart hammered in my chest. Hunger? I didn't understand. What did it mean? What was it asking me? I tried to speak, but no words came. I tried to move, but my body remained still, as though bound by invisible chains. The darkness seemed to press on me from all sides, suffocating me, making it impossible to take a full breath. "Yes," the voice continued, its tone shifting, now smooth and seductive, like a cold wind whispering through the trees. "You can feel it, can't you? The pull of the meadow. It calls to you. It has always called to you." The words sank into my mind like stones, heavy and suffocating. My heart raced, a frenzied rhythm that matched the rapid fire of my thoughts. This isn't real. It can't be real. I'm just dreaming. The voice laughed, a soft, mocking sound. "Dreams are a kind of reality, Emma. You should know that by now." Suddenly, I felt the ground beneath me shift again, and before I could react, I was pulled upward violently, forcefully, until I slammed against something hard. A wall. A ceiling? I couldn't tell. My senses were distorted, every sound amplified, every touch too real, too close. My skin prickled, the sensation of eyes on me, all around me, never leaving. And then, the darkness lifted. It was replaced by the same cold, unforgiving landscape, the meadow. But this time, it wasn't the open field I had seen before. It was something else. A place far worse. The trees that surrounded me were gnarled and twisted, their limbs like bony fingers reaching toward the sky, clawing at the air. The ground beneath me was covered in a thick, black fog that seemed to seep from the earth itself. And standing before me, waiting, was the figure. Its glowing red eyes pierced through the fog like twin lanterns, casting an eerie light that danced across the mist. It was tall, impossibly tall, its shape barely discernible, just a silhouette of dark limbs and a long, twisted form that seemed to shift with every blink. The creature didn't move, it simply stood there, watching. "You've come for the truth," it said, its voice a guttural growl that reverberated in my bones. "The truth about the meadow. About what lies beneath." I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry, empty, as if all the fear, all the breath, had been stolen from me. My body trembled, not just from the cold, but from the weight of its presence. This thing that had been calling to me, had been waiting for me. "You are the last," it continued. "The last to fall into the grasp of the meadow. The last to hear its whispers. You are the final one." The words didn't make sense. Last? What did it mean? The final one for what? The creature stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Each step seemed to distort the air around it, creating ripples in the fog, distorting the reality of what I was seeing. I felt my breath catch in my throat, my eyes wide with terror. The creature's voice came again, softer this time, almost like a coaxing whisper. "Do you remember the others, Emma? The ones who came before you? The ones who heard the whispers? They were drawn here, just like you. And now, they are part of it. Part of the meadow." I struggled to breathe, to move, but my body refused to obey. I was paralyzed, trapped in this nightmarish reality, unable to escape. "It's a cycle, you see," the creature continued. "The meadow claims them. The voices, they bring them here, and they never leave. They become part of the land. part of the whispers. And soon, you will too. The fog swirled around me, thick and suffocating, and in that moment, I understood. The meadow was alive. Not just with the whispers or the shadows, but with the souls of those who had come before me. They were trapped here, their presence imprinted on the land, their voices forever echoing through the trees, through the mist, through the very air. And now, I was one of them. I felt it in my chest, that slow, creeping pull that only the creature had spoken of. It was inside me now, part of me. I was becoming part of the meadow. I wanted to scream, to fight, but I couldn't. The voices surrounded me now, not just one, but many, thousands of them, all speaking at once, calling my name, whispering their truths, their horrors. And then, in that final moment, I understood. The voices weren't just calling my name. They were telling me the truth. The meadow didn't just want us to hear its whispers. It wanted us to become part of them. To join the endless cycle of fear, of longing, of darkness. I felt the ground shift again, and the creature's eyes locked with mine. It wasn't just watching me anymore, it was waiting. And then, everything went black. The meadow had claimed me. The horizontal waterfall in Missouri. It's easy to ignore a whisper, isn't it? Just a soft, almost unnoticeable sound that flutters around you, like the wind brushing against your ear. But what if that whisper calls your name? I wasn't prepared for what I found when I stumbled across the waterfall in Missouri. I had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in the small town near the river had their theories, but none of them were quite like what I experienced that day. I had gone for a hike, eager for a break from my usual routine, the world growing quieter the farther I walked from the town. The path was familiar, a place where I'd wandered before. But this time, something felt different. The air, thick with humidity, seemed heavier. The trees, their leaves whispering in the breeze, felt darker somehow. And then I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the sound of water running. But when I looked up, I saw it. The waterfall wasn't falling in the usual way. It wasn't cascading down the rocks as I expected. Instead, the water moved sideways, flowing horizontally, as if gravity itself had given up its hold on the world. My steps faltered, and my heart skipped. This wasn't normal. It couldn't be. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to make sense of it. I had read about strange phenomena before, distorted landscapes, odd anomalies in nature, but this felt different. I took a step forward, compelled by some invisible force. The sound of the water was soothing, yet unnerving, as though it was calling to me, urging me closer. But as I moved, something strange began to happen. It was subtle at first, just a slight heaviness in my legs, as though they were becoming weighed down by an invisible force. I paused, confused. This is ridiculous, I thought. I'm just tired. The hike is longer than I expected. But the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it grew. My legs felt heavier, as if the earth beneath me had grown sticky, as though I was moving through water, not air. My feet dragged, each step more labored than the last. I turned back, thinking I'd leave, but when I tried to retrace my steps, something was off. The path seemed longer now, the trees surrounding me taller, more oppressive. The sun, which had been shining brightly only minutes before, was now hidden behind thick clouds, casting the entire place in an eerie twilight. I paused again. This wasn't right. There was something about the waterfall, something wrong about it. But still, I couldn't look away. The whisper grew louder. It was soft, a faint murmur at the back of my mind, but the longer I stood there, the clearer it became. It wasn't just a whisper, it was a voice. A voice that seemed to hum beneath the sound of the water, filling the space around me. I could almost hear my name. Emma. Emma. I froze. It's nothing. I'm just tired, I thought, but even as I told myself that, I knew it wasn't true. The air felt colder now, more suffocating. I tried to move again, but my legs barely obeyed. They felt like they were being pulled into the ground. I glanced at the water again, my gaze drawn to the horizontal flow, the strange movement that defied everything I knew about nature. The sound of it, at first soothing, now felt wrong. It was like a low hum, reverberating through the air, rattling my bones. Something shifted. A figure, no taller than a shadow, flitted at the edge of my vision. It was gone before I could fully process it, just a flicker of movement among the trees. But it was enough to make my skin crawl. I turned back to the waterfall, feeling a pull I couldn't resist. The whisper was louder now, as if it was coming from all around me. The voice calling my name. My body trembled, but I couldn't move. And then, without warning, the ground beneath me seemed to shift. The earth groaned, the trees creaked. The air grew thick, and my legs buckled. I collapsed onto the ground, my hands sinking into the dirt as I tried to steady myself. No. No, no, no. This isn't real. But the more I tried to deny it, the more everything seemed to press in around me. The weight of the air, the hum of the water, the feeling of eyes on me from every direction. And just when I thought I might escape, when I tried to push myself up again, I heard the whisper one final time. It wasn't in my head anymore, it was right behind me. Stay. I froze. For the first time since I'd arrived, I felt trapped. The moment I turned my head to look, I couldn't see anyone or anything, but I felt a presence, something close, something dark. And then, the water, it started to rise. It wasn't just flowing horizontally anymore. It was spilling, creeping, inching toward me, its surface shimmering with an unnatural glow. The hum of the waterfall turned to a roar, drowning out everything else. I tried to run. I tried to escape, but my legs didn't listen. They were too heavy. My heart raced in my chest, but my body felt like it was frozen in place. And in that moment, I realized there was no escape. The waterfall wasn't just water, it was a trap. And I was caught in its pull, just like the countless others who had come before me. I couldn't move. Every muscle in my body screamed to escape, to run, but my legs refused to obey. It was as though something invisible was holding me down, pressing me into the ground. The sound of the waterfall was deafening now, a constant roar that seemed to echo not just in my ears but in my skull, rattling my thoughts, drying everything else. The air around me was thick, suffocating. Stay. The word echoed in my mind, the whisper growing louder, clearer. I tried to look behind me, but all I saw was the shifting shadow, that same presence that lingered just beyond my reach, its form never fully visible. Was it human? Animal? I couldn't tell. It was just a presence, an overwhelming sense of something ancient and dark. I glanced back at the waterfall. The water, once flowing horizontally, now seemed to pulse, as if alive, as if the very current was breathing. It moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm, like the heartbeat of something colossal hiding beneath the surface. But it wasn't the water that drew my attention now. It was the way it was moving closer, inch by inch, toward me. The ground beneath me trembled again, and I could feel the vibrations in my chest. My heart began to race. This wasn't just an anomaly. It was a force, one that didn't belong here, that shouldn't exist. But it did. Why is this happening? The question flitted across my mind like a spark, but there were no answers, only the overwhelming sense of danger closing in. My breath was shallow, my hands cold, and yet, as I tried to push myself up again, the weight in my legs deepened. They felt like they were sinking into the earth itself. It's the waterfall, I realized. The pull. It was getting stronger. It wasn't just the weight on my body, it was something else, something more powerful. The air around me was thick, almost sticky, as though the very atmosphere was turning against me. I could feel the water now, like it was reaching for me, creeping toward me, wrapping itself around me. I forced my legs to move again, but I wasn't getting anywhere. With every step I tried to take, it felt like I was walking through tar. My movements were slow, sluggish. I turned back to the waterfall, expecting it to be even closer, but what I saw made my breath catch in my throat. The water had stopped moving. It wasn't flowing horizontally anymore. It was completely still, a massive, dark wall of water suspended in midair. The surface gleamed, reflecting the dark sky above, and for a moment, everything was eerily silent. The hum, the roar, it was gone. Just silence. But that silence was more terrifying than any sound. It was as though the world itself had held its breath, waiting for something. And then, the water moved again. It didn't flow. It didn't cascade. It shot forward, fast, like a tidal wave crashing through the air, its force overwhelming. I barely had time to react. I stumbled backward, trying to escape, but the weight of my legs was too much. My body was frozen, caught in the pull of the water. The roar of the waterfall grew again, deafening, drowning out all other sound. The force of the water surged forward, pushing against me. It was like a giant hand reaching out to pull me in. The ground beneath me cracked, and I could feel the earth shifting, the landscape warping. Time itself seemed to stretch and bend, slowing, warping. I turned to face the trees, trying to get away from the pull of the water. But the trees were no longer where they had been. The path I had come down was gone, replaced by a twisting, dark tunnel of roots and shadows. The world around me had become a maze, its edges blurring, shifting, rearranging. I was lost. The whisper returned. Stay. This time, it wasn't just in my mind. It was everywhere. In the air. In the trees. In the water. The word echoed, swirling around me, wrapping itself around my thoughts. It wasn't a command. It wasn't a plea. It was a promise. A promise that I couldn't escape. I tried to move, tried to find the path again, but my body was so heavy. The water surged forward, its energy flooding the ground beneath me, flooding the space around me, filling every corner of my mind. And that's when I realized something far worse than just being trapped in the present. The waterfall was changing time itself. The air was so thick with the pull of the water that I could feel the seconds stretch, twist, and break apart. The more I struggled to move, the slower everything became. My body fought against it, but the more I fought, the more I sank into its grip. This isn't real. This can't be real. My mind screamed, but the waterfall didn't care. It kept coming closer, its icy pull growing stronger. I could feel my thoughts becoming sluggish, my mind clouded. The more I tried to resist, the more I was drawn to it. And then, in the stillness, I heard something else. Something that cut through the water's hum. A voice. Not the whisper of my name, but a louder, deeper voice. "You're already here." The words echoed through my mind, and in that instant, I understood. It wasn't just pulling me toward the water. It was pulling me toward itself. The waterfall wasn't just an anomaly. It was a prison. A prison where time stood still, where the world outside didn't exist anymore. And I was already trapped inside it. I wanted to scream, but my mouth was dry, my voice stolen by the sheer force of the waterfall's presence. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And as I stood there, frozen in place, the last thing I saw before the world swallowed me whole was the water stretching outward, creeping toward me, and the shadow in its depths, its glowing eyes watching me. Stay. I don't know how long I stood there. It could have been hours. Or maybe it had only been a few minutes. Time felt broken. Everything felt warped, like I was suspended between moments, neither moving forward nor back. The waterfall, now a vast, silent mass of water, hung ominously in the air. The presence that surrounded me was suffocating, pulling at me with invisible tendrils. It wasn't the weight of my body that was slowing me down now, it was something deeper. Something far more insidious. The voice was still there. In the air. In my mind. Stay. It wasn't just a command anymore, it felt like a truth, a reality that I couldn't escape. My legs trembled, and I tried to move, but the ground beneath me was so thick, so heavy, that it felt like I was wading through water itself. Every time I tried to force myself forward, my limbs screamed in protest. It was as if the earth itself was conspiring to keep me here. I stumbled, my body heavy, like I was being pulled into the center of the earth itself. My breath came out in shallow gasps, but no air seemed to fill my lungs. I looked up again at the waterfall. It loomed before me, still frozen in time. But as my gaze held it, I saw something new. A shape, no, several shapes slowly emerged from the water. At first, they were nothing more than shadows, indistinct figures shifting beneath the surface. But as they grew clearer, I could make out more details. There were eyes. Eyes like glowing orbs, shifting, darting, watching. Hundreds of them. And they were all fixed on me. Panic surged in my chest, my heartbeat racing as I backed away. But again, the ground seemed to hold me in place, unyielding. I couldn't escape. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The shapes in the water began to move more distinctly now. They were no longer just shadows. They were creatures. But not anything I had ever seen before. They were long and twisting, like serpents, but with limbs, arms, legs, and claws. Their bodies shimmered in the moonlight, their movements fluid, like water itself, but their eyes, those glowing, malevolent eyes, stared at me with a hunger I could feel in my bones. I wanted to scream, to run, but no sound escaped me. The pressure in the air was too thick, too suffocating. My body refused to obey me. Stay, the voice whispered again. It echoed louder, and with it, I could hear the faint sound of slithering. The creatures were getting closer. The ground shook, but this time it wasn't just the trembling of the earth. It was something else, a low, vibrating hum, like the sound of something enormous, something ancient, waking from a long, deep sleep. My mind raced. Where are they? What do they want? I had no answers. I could only watch in horror as the creatures began to emerge from the waterfall. Their forms were grotesque, twisted, and wrong. I felt a surge of dizziness, my vision swimming. I tried to take a step back, but my legs were like lead. And then, the ground gave way. With a sickening lurch, I felt myself falling. Not downward, but sideways. The earth seemed to tilt beneath me, and before I could even scream, I was tumbling into the water. But it wasn't water, it was like liquid air, cold and suffocating, wrapping itself around me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't see. All I could feel was the cold pressure closing in. The creatures were all around me now, their limbs like tendrils, reaching, pulling, dragging me deeper into the water. I tried to fight, tried to break free, but they were too strong. Their eyes glowed like lanterns in the dark, each one burning with an unholy light. They didn't speak, but I could feel their thoughts pressing against mine, silent, alien thoughts, invasive and relentless. I wasn't just trapped in a place. I was trapped in time. Time had broken. The world had broken. I was sinking deeper, losing my sense of self. The voice was everywhere, drowning out my thoughts. Stay. And then I heard it. A sound, different from the hum of the creatures, different from the roar of the waterfall. It was faint at first, almost like a whisper, but it grew louder, closer. I tried to focus, to understand what it was. My vision swam, but then, through the darkness, I saw it. A figure. A person, standing at the edge of a waterfall. I couldn't make out who they were, but they were there, looking at me. I reached out, my hand trembling, desperate. Help me, I thought. Please, help me. But they didn't move. They didn't speak. They just stood there. I felt my body grow colder, weaker. The creatures were closing in, their cold limbs brushing against my skin. Stay. The voice was so loud now, it felt like it was inside my skull. The pressure on my chest intensified, and I realized with a sickening jolt that I wasn't just losing my breath. I was losing myself. I watched as the figure at the waterfall turned, slowly, deliberately, and walked away. And in that moment, I understood. They weren't here to help me. They were part of this place, part of the prison. I had never been meant to leave. The creatures surrounded me completely, their cold eyes watching, their bodies pressing against mine, pulling me deeper into the abyss. And as I felt myself being consumed, swallowed by the endless water, the last thought that crossed my mind was a quiet, terrible realization. I was never meant to escape. The world around me faded to black. I don't know how long I had been submerged. Time had slipped away completely. What was left of my mind clung to fragments of thought, but they were becoming as slippery and foreign as the water that suffocated me. Every breath felt like a struggle, as if the air was thickening, compressing, drawing out the last traces of my consciousness. But just when I thought it might be over, something shifted. The water, if that's what it was, seemed to release me. The pressure that had been closing in on me suddenly lessened, and I found myself gasping for air. The heavy weight, the suffocating hold of the creatures that had surrounded me, was gone. For a moment, I believed I had escaped. I thought that perhaps I had been freed. But when I opened my eyes, everything had changed. The landscape around me was unrecognizable. The water had receded, but the air was still thick with the unnatural hum, the heavy, oppressive sound that echoed in my chest. The waterfall, that bizarre, horizontal mass of water, loomed in the distance, unchanged, unyielding. I tried to stand, but the ground beneath me was soft, shifting. It wasn't solid. I stumbled and fell to my knees, my legs still heavy, my body still unresponsive. The light was wrong here, dim and warped, as if the sun itself had been trapped in a perpetual twilight. I stood again, shakily, and looked around, trying to make sense of where I was. But all I saw were the creatures. Not in the water this time. No, now they were everywhere. Their glowing eyes blinked at me from all corners. They weren't just watching, they were waiting. A faint rustling behind me drew my attention, and I turned to see another figure. The same figure as before. They were standing at the edge of the water, just like I had seen before. They didn't look back this time, they just stood there, unmoving. Something about them felt wrong. The figure was not human. It wasn't even something I could comprehend. Its form shimmered, distorted, like the reflection of a person seen in water, but with something else, something darker. I could hear their footsteps now, despite their stillness, as if they were echoing from deep within the earth itself. I tried to call out, but no sound left my mouth. The air around me was too thick for words, for sound. It was as though I had lost the ability to speak. The only thing left was the silence and the dreadful presence that surrounded me. The figure's eyes, those endless, dark eyes, turned toward me. The moment our gazes locked, a jolt of ice pierced my chest, a feeling colder than anything I had ever known. I wanted to look away, to flee, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't let me. It wasn't just the weight of fear or the creatures or the endless water. No. It was something worse, something far older. I felt it pressing against my thoughts, clouding my mind. And then, the voice came again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. You belong here. It was not a command. It was not an order. It was the undeniable truth of this place. The voice was no longer an echo. It had become my own thoughts, my own reality. It was as if the words themselves had invaded my very soul. I felt them move inside me, rearranging my understanding of everything. The world around me shifted once more. The ground beneath my feet cracked, and the sky above seemed to fold into itself, turning dark, then black. The creatures closed in on me. I could feel their breath on my skin, the cold, clammy touch of their limbs, like the embrace of death itself. I tried to run. I tried to scream, but my body wouldn't obey. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I couldn't think. You belong here. The voice was all-encompassing now, surrounding me, swallowing me. I felt my identity dissolve, my memories slipping through my fingers like sand. Who was I? What was I? It didn't matter anymore. I wasn't an individual. I was part of this place, part of the water, part of the creatures, part of the darkness. And then, just when I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, the pressure eased. The creatures paused, their glowing eyes fixed on me, their limbs freezing in place. The figure, the one that had been standing so still, began to move, walking toward me with a deliberate slowness, their presence too enormous, too overwhelming to comprehend. It reached out its hand, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of humanity, a sliver of hope, a flash of recognition. But as I reached toward it, the moment was gone. The figure's form distorted, twisted, and it was no longer a person at all. It was something ancient, something terrifying, something that had no place in this world. The figure reached toward me with long, skeletal fingers, their nails sharp and jagged, like the remnants of forgotten nightmares. I screamed. This time I actually screamed, though it was a scream without sound, a cry that rang out only in the hollow spaces of my mind. And then, in an instant, the figure was gone. The creatures vanished, the earth split open beneath me, and I fell once more, not into water, but into an endless abyss, a void where nothing could be heard, nothing could be seen. I couldn't tell where I was anymore. I couldn't tell what was real. But as I fell, one final thought gripped me. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. And I was never meant to escape. I felt my body slam into something solid, a sharp, sudden pain coursing through me. I opened my eyes. There was no water. No creatures. No figure. Just a forest. It was all wrong, though. The trees towered overhead, their trunks twisted and gnarled, as if they had been alive for centuries, perhaps much longer than anything human could remember. The sky overhead was a sickly shade of yellow, as though the very sun had been drained of life. The waterfall, the horizontal one, stood in the distance, but it wasn't a waterfall anymore. It was a vast chasm, an infinite void, stretching into the distance, devouring everything. And I was standing at its edge. I turned to look around, hoping to see something familiar. But there was no escape. There was no path forward. Just the void, stretching on forever, and the creatures that watched me from the shadows, waiting for me to step forward. The air was thick, suffocating, and the voice, that same, all-encompassing voice, whispered in my ear again. You belong here. And this time, I couldn't deny it. I stood frozen at the edge of the abyss. Every part of me screamed to turn away, to run, to escape whatever this was, but my body refused. The thick, oppressive air weighed down on me, as though the very atmosphere was alive, pressing against my chest with each breath. My heart pounded, its rhythm erratic and frantic, but the voice in my head, was calm, soothing, like a lullaby sung by something far older than human understanding. You belong here. I tried to move. I wanted to, with everything I had. But my feet felt like lead, as though the ground itself had reached up and clamped down on me. My legs were no longer mine. They felt like strangers attached to my body, twisted and deformed. The waterfall, the chasm, seemed to call to me, its infinite expanse stretching further than my eyes could comprehend. It was a pull, not just physical but something deeper, something spiritual. I blinked hard, trying to clear the fog that had descended over my thoughts. What was this place? How had I gotten here? The trees, the darkened sky, the unrelenting sound of the waterfall, it was all wrong, out of place, as if the world itself had been turned inside out and I was standing at the very center of it, suspended in time. My senses were overrun. My skin tingled with an unnatural cold, my ears filled with an unearthly hum, a constant drone that vibrated through my bones. I looked at the creatures, at least, I assumed that's what they were. Their eyes glowed in the shadows, their movements unnaturally still. They didn't move closer, not yet. But I knew, without a doubt, that they were waiting for me to make the first move. Was this the fate I had been doomed to? To be trapped in this place, this endless cycle of terror and desolation? I wanted to scream again, to call for help, but my voice was lost to the void. There was no one who could hear me. No one who could help me escape this cursed place. The ground beneath me trembled, ever so slightly, a soft vibration that I could feel in my chest. It was the sound of something coming. Something large. Something ancient. The figure appeared again, emerging from the shadows at the edge of my vision, standing silently as if it had always been there, watching me. Its form seemed to flicker, shifting between human and something else entirely, something monstrous. I wanted to run, but my feet were still planted firmly in place. I tried to force myself to move, but it was no use. The air itself seemed to have solidified, holding me in place, binding me to this nightmare. The figure stepped forward, its eyes never leaving mine. The darkness that surrounded it felt alive, as though it breathed along with the creature. It stopped just a few feet away, its presence overwhelming, crushing every thought I had. I could feel it probing my mind, reading my fears, my deepest secrets. It was in my head, in my very soul. I could hear its voice, not just in my ears, but inside me, resonating through every fiber of my being. You were always meant to be here. The words were not comforting. They were a judgment, a final verdict that I could not escape. My mind raced, trying to grasp at anything, any shred of logic that could explain what was happening. But there was nothing. Only darkness. Only fear. You have no choice, not anymore. The world shifted around me, folding and bending like the edges of a torn page. I tried to close my eyes, to shut it out, but the darkness was all-consuming. It filled my vision, my thoughts. The pressure in my chest grew unbearable. And then, I felt it, the pull. The compulsion to step forward, to cross the threshold into the chasm that had once been the waterfall. I fought it. I fought with everything I had, but it was no use. My feet, my legs, my body, everything moved without my consent. I took one step, then another. The creatures, still watching from the shadows, began to move toward me, their eyes glowing brighter, their forms becoming more defined. I couldn't stop. I reached the edge. My foot hovered over the abyss. I felt the cold, dark air rising from the chasm, like it was alive, eager to consume me. You belong here. And just like that, I stepped forward. Into the void. Into the unknown. There was no sound, no final scream. The world collapsed around me. The ground vanished beneath my feet. The last thing I saw was the shimmering figure, watching me, waiting. And then, nothing. The void swallowed me whole. No one would ever know what happened to me. My body, my name, would disappear into the mist of forgotten stories. The waterfall, now a true chasm, stood silent, its waters forever still, awaiting the next soul to come too close, to step into the pull of the endless abyss. The creatures remained, their eyes glowing in the depths, waiting. And the voice? It never left. It whispered, soft and sure, in the wind that carried across the horizon. You belong here. Dawes Field in Arkansas. It was the kind of place most people would avoid if they had any sense. Hidden away deep in the backwoods of Arkansas, the field had a reputation, one that didn't belong in any travel guide. No tourists dared venture near it, not unless they wanted more than just a taste of fear. The locals whispered stories about it, each tale more bizarre than the last. They told of strange happenings, odd sounds in the night, and an eerie sensation of being watched. But it was the Dawes that had made the place infamous. The first time I heard about the field was during a conversation at the local diner. It wasn't much more than a passing comment, tossed out casually by one of the older men who had lived in the town longer than I could imagine. "You ever heard of the field with the dolls?" he'd asked, his voice low, as if sharing a secret no one else should know. You do well to stay clear of it. At the time, I didn't pay much attention. Strange things happen in small towns, but that wasn't enough to make me think twice. After all, there was nothing more than a few dolls hanging on trees, right? Nothing to be afraid of. Or so I thought. But curiosity got the better of me. A few weeks later, after a long day of driving through the winding country roads, I found myself not far from that very field. I could see the tree line up ahead, the shapes of old wooden structures peeking out from behind the thick overgrowth. And then, I saw them, the dolls. Hundreds of them, their pale, porcelain faces staring at me from every branch, every tree. Their hair was matted, their clothes faded, some of their eyes were cracked, while others were just still. It was unnerving, to say the least. I stepped out of the car, drawn by some magnetic force that I couldn't explain. The air felt colder here, thick with an unnatural stillness. No birds, no insects. Just the rustling of dry leaves beneath my boots and the strange sight of those dolls. My mind kept racing with questions. Why were they here? Why had someone put them up on these trees? The idea of people coming out here to hang up dolls seemed ludicrous, yet there they were, as if they had always been part of the landscape. For a brief moment, I thought about turning around. Something in the air, something in the way the dolls seemed to watch me, made me hesitate. But I took another step forward. The closer I got, the more I noticed details that I hadn't seen from the road. The dolls didn't seem to be randomly placed. They were arranged with a kind of order, their heads tilted in ways that seemed deliberate, as if they were all part of a larger, sinister design. And then, in the distance, I heard it, a soft giggle. It sounded like a child's laugh, light and innocent at first, but it carried an undertone that was anything but playful. My breath caught in my throat. I looked around, trying to locate the source. But the laughter faded as quickly as it had come. It was the kind of sound that lingered in your mind long after you'd heard it. I shook my head, trying to rationalize it. It's just the wind, I told myself. Just the wind and the creaking of the trees. But as I continued walking, I noticed the shadows growing longer, the light starting to fade. The sun was setting, casting a dim orange glow over the field. The dolls, they seemed to move in the dimming light. I couldn't be sure, but I thought I saw one of them sway, its head turning just a fraction. I froze, staring, but no movement followed. It was as if the entire scene was playing tricks on me. I turned my head, hoping to find some comfort in the familiar surroundings, but the silence was deafening. Then, out of nowhere, I heard it again. A whisper this time, a barely audible sound, like someone was calling my name from deep within the trees. I snapped my head back, scanning the field, but saw nothing. No movement, no figures. Just the dolls. Watching. I told myself I had to leave. The unease was creeping under my skin, twisting into something darker, something more primal. But as I turned toward the road, a rustling sound made me stop dead in my tracks. It wasn't the wind. No, this sound was too deliberate. Too alive. I turned again, my heart pounding now. The field was still, but now the dolls felt closer. Their eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, seemed to follow me, tracking my every movement. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. I should have left then. But the curiosity kept me rooted to the spot, the need to understand what was happening here gnawing at me. I was being drawn in, whether I liked it or not. The longer I stood there, the stronger the sense of being surrounded became. And then I heard the footsteps. They were faint at first, like the padding of small feet on the earth. But they grew louder, coming from every direction, moving toward me. My stomach twisted with fear, and I turned in every direction, trying to pinpoint where they were coming from. The air was suddenly cold, the shadows deeper than before. My breath came in short bursts as I realized I wasn't alone. I wasn't alone at all. I wanted to run. Every instinct in me screamed to get out of that field, to tear through the trees and back to the safety of my car. But my feet felt rooted to the ground, as if something unseen was holding me there, forcing me to stay. The footsteps were growing closer, each step more deliberate than the last, the sound now unmistakable, tiny feet, soft and light, yet filled with purpose. I spun around again, my heart thundering in my chest. There was nothing. No one. But the dolls. They had shifted, ever so slightly, as if they were inching toward me with every moment I stood still. I could feel their empty eyes upon me, their glassy gazes piercing through the fading light. The laugh, high-pitched and childlike, floated through the air again, this time accompanied by a faint giggle. It sent a chill crawling up my spine. I shook my head, trying to dispel the thoughts that clung to my mind. This isn't real. This is just my mind playing tricks. It's the isolation, I told myself. But even as I thought it, I knew deep down that something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones, a sense of impending doom that grew stronger with every passing second. Then, something moved. I caught a glimpse of it from the corner of my eye. A shadow darting between the trees. It wasn't just a shift of the light, like I had hoped. No, it was real. Something, or someone, was out there, just beyond my sight, lurking in the darkness. A cold wind whipped through the field, and I felt it tug at my clothes, pulling me toward the trees. I fought it, resisting the urge to move forward, but the whispering voices seemed to grow louder, more frantic. They were beckoning me, taunting me. I looked back toward the road, desperately searching for a way out. But the path seemed farther now, the distance stretching with every second I hesitated. I had to leave. Now. But before I could take a step, I heard it. A loud crack, like something heavy breaking underfoot, followed by a low, grating growl. My heart skipped a beat. There, just at the edge of the field, I saw it, a massive shape moving between the trees, its silhouette dark against the dimming sky. It wasn't human. It wasn't even an animal. It was something else, something far worse. The creature's glowing eyes shone from the shadows, two piercing points of light that reflected the dying rays of the sun. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The creature came closer, its form becoming clearer with each step. It was tall, unnaturally so, its body hunched and covered in ragged fur. But what caught my attention were its hands. No, not hands, paws, claws, sharp and twitching with anticipation. It moved like a predator, its every step deliberate, each one bringing it closer to me. And then, just as I thought it might reach me, I saw something else, a pair of dolls, their faces contorted into twisted grins, swinging gently from the branches of a nearby tree. The creature stopped, its eyes locked onto mine. It tilted its head slightly, as if assessing me. My body froze, but my mind was racing. It's just a trick. It's not real. It can't be real. But then, the growl came again, deeper this time, vibrating through the ground beneath my feet. The dolls, their porcelain faces now cracked and twisted, seemed to laugh along with the creature, their hollow eyes glinting in the fading light. I couldn't take it anymore. The terror, the madness, it all swelled inside me, threatening to swallow me whole. I turned and bolted, my feet pounding the earth, my breath ragged as I ran toward the road. But the further I went, the more the darkness seemed to press in around me, and the laughter, the child's laugh, followed me, echoing in the trees, growing louder, closer. I didn't dare look back. I ran until my legs ached, until the very air felt thick with something suffocating, pressing against my chest. But when I finally burst out of the trees and reached the road, I saw something that made my blood run cold. My car. It was still there, parked just as I had left it. But the dolls were there, too. Every single one. They were hanging from the branches of the trees by the roadside, their eyes all fixed on me, watching with an unnerving intensity. The road, the trees, the car, it was all the same as when I had first arrived. Nothing had changed. Except for one thing. The dolls, they were closer now. And I realized, with a sickening certainty, that no matter how far I ran, no matter how fast I tried to escape, the dolls would always be there, watching. Waiting. As I turned to run again, the ground beneath me seemed to shift. I stumbled, my foot catching on something, and when I looked down, I saw the unmistakable marks in the dirt. Tiny footprints, leading in my direction. I wasn't alone. And that was when I understood. The dolls didn't just haunt the field. They were the field. And I had just become part of their collection. The last thing I heard before everything went silent was the soft sound of a giggle. Then, nothing. I woke up, not sure how long I had been unconscious. The world around me was silent, too silent, as though it had been holding its breath. The last memory I had was the sound of my feet pounding the earth, the dolls growing closer, and the growing sense of doom that had tightened its grip on my chest. But now, everything was still. I blinked, trying to make sense of where I was. The ground beneath me was cold, damp, and uneven. My hands scraped against dirt and gravel as I pushed myself up. My legs felt like rubber, weak and unsteady. I glanced around, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. I was no longer in the field. Instead, I found myself in a place that felt far more suffocating, darker. The air was thick with moisture, the smell of mildew and earth clinging to my lungs. The walls were made of cracked stone, and faint, flickering light came from a distant, unevenly lit corridor. I could hear the faint sound of something moving, something scraping against the stone, soft and slow, like claws dragging along the ground. The sound made my heart race again. I tried to stand, but my legs felt like they weren't my own. My head spun, and for a moment, I thought I might collapse again. But I couldn't. Something, some instinct, pushed me forward, telling me that I had to keep moving. I wasn't sure where I was or how I had gotten here, but I had to find a way out. The walls around me seemed to close in, narrowing as I stumbled through the tunnel. The air was growing colder. And then I heard it, the whispering. It was faint at first, like a voice carried on the wind. But as I kept moving, it grew louder, clearer, more distinct. It was a chorus of voices, a hissing whispering that seemed to come from every direction. The voices were speaking in a language I couldn't understand, but the tone, it was full of malice, of something far older than anything I could comprehend. They know you're here. I froze, my blood turning to ice. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to know what was behind me. But the whispers were growing louder, and they were so close now. The scratching sound, like claws, was unmistakable. Something was following me. I had to run. But where? The tunnel stretched endlessly before me, no way out, no end in sight. I felt the wave of panic closing in, the walls of the tunnel seemingly pressing in on me, as if they were alive, squeezing, trapping me. The whispers turned into giggles. I whipped around, my breath shallow, trying to make sense of the impossible. But there was nothing there. Nothing but the flickering light, the creeping darkness, and the silence that pressed down on me like a suffocating blanket. Get out. The voice was so clear now, so commanding. I looked up. In the distance, I saw something moving, something large and fast. My heart skipped a beat, and I instinctively backed away, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the creature that was coming toward me. It wasn't a man. It wasn't a beast. It was something else. Something unnatural. It was tall, its body hunched and long, covered in thick, dark fur. Its eyes gleamed in the low light, two burning spots of malevolent intelligence that locked onto mine with horrifying precision. It wasn't the dull creature from the field. No, this was worse. This was something darker. I could hear the sound of its breath, ragged and labored, as it neared. The scraping sound of claws on stone intensified, louder now, closer. And I understood. The thing wasn't just hunting me. It had been waiting for me. I turned and ran. I ran blindly, my feet slipping on the uneven ground, my heart pounding in my chest. The tunnel seemed to stretch and twist, its walls narrowing and then widening as though it were alive, reacting to my panic. I could feel the creature's presence behind me, feel the heat of its breath as it drew closer. The whispers had turned into guttural growls, low and rumbling, filling the air with an unbearable pressure. I couldn't outrun it. I knew that now. It was faster, stronger, more dangerous. And then I saw it, a light. A flicker of pale blue light up ahead. The end of the tunnel. I pushed myself harder, desperation giving me strength I didn't know I had. But just as I reached the light, I felt it. The claws, sharp and cold, closing around my ankle. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the walls of the tunnel. I was pulled back, my body crashing into the cold stone, the air knocked from my lungs. I gasped, trying to push myself up, but it was too strong. The creature had me. Its eyes locked onto mine again, and in that moment, I saw something. Something horrifying. The creature wasn't just after me. It was after my soul. I could feel it. The darkness inside the thing was trying to swallow me whole, pulling me down into its depths. My mind screamed for escape, but my body was paralyzed, as if something was siphoning the very will to fight from me. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the creature released its grip. It stepped back, its eyes narrowing. For a moment, I thought it was letting me go, but the cold truth hit me, it was waiting. Before I could react, the walls of the tunnel seemed to close in tighter, the light flickering until it was gone. The whispers were louder now, coming from all directions, and I realized with a sickening certainty that there was no escape. I wasn't in control. I never had been. The last thing I heard was the sound of those giggles, echoing around me, growing louder and louder, until it became the only thing I could hear. Then, silence. And darkness. I don't know how long I lay there, curled up in the cold darkness. My body ached, my head spinning, and the fear, the deep, gnawing fear, clung to me like a second skin. I had tried to move, to escape, but every time I stirred, the echoes of those giggles and the scraping of claws would fill the air, paralyzing me with terror. The tunnel, if it could even be called that now, was a labyrinth of endless corridors, twisting and turning with no sense of direction. Every time I thought I might be making progress, the walls would shift, the air would thicken, and I would find myself back where I had started. I sat up, my hands trembling as I wiped the dirt and sweat from my face. My breath was shallow, ragged. My heart still raced, but it was different now, fainter, slower, as if it had grown accustomed to the terror, resigned to the fact that there was no way out. The realization settled in me like a weight I couldn't escape. This place, whatever it was, wasn't just some twisted nightmare, it was real. And I was trapped in it. For the first time, I forced myself to look around, to take stock of my surroundings. The walls were slick, covered in a thick, slimy coating that gleamed faintly in the dim light. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of decay and something far worse, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It was the smell of death, of something long forgotten and abandoned. The light. It flickered again, far off in the distance. It called to me, as if promising escape, or at least an answer to the growing madness. My mind screamed at me to turn away, to stay hidden, to wait out whatever was hunting me. But my body moved on its own, driven by an instinct I couldn't name. I got to my feet, stumbling forward, my heart thudding loudly in my chest, almost drowning out the soft, echoing whispers that still filled the tunnel. The path seemed endless, stretching out before me like a cruel joke. And with each step, the whispers grew louder, their words more distinct. "Come closer." I froze. The voice, soft and coaxing, was no longer a murmur. It was a command. And it was coming from everywhere. "Come closer, we're waiting." I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my pulse pounding in my ears. I could feel the pressure of their gaze, of the dolls and creatures that watched from the shadows, their eyes following me in the dark. The whispering wasn't just words anymore. It was a pull, like invisible hands reaching out to drag me towards something I couldn't understand. The light flickered again, more brightly now. I had no choice but to follow. As I drew nearer, I saw it clearly, a large door, wooden and ancient, with intricate carvings etched into its surface. It was a doorway, but not to the world I had known. This place, whatever it was its own reality. And it was closing in on me, its boundaries shifting with each passing second. I reached for the handle, my fingers numb, hesitant. The whispers grew louder, more urgent now. They were all around me, crawling inside my skull, filling me with dread and an odd sense of hunger. As if something inside me wanted to give in to the call, wanted to open the door and face whatever lay beyond. But I resisted. I pulled my hand back, feeling my body shake with fear. Then I heard it. A shriek. High-pitched, shrill, the sound of something wrong, something unnatural. It came from behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. A shadow. But it was more than a shadow. It was a shape, tall and twisted, a grotesque figure emerging from the darkness. It moved with unnatural speed, its body a blur of shifting limbs and jagged, broken lines. It wasn't human. It was something far worse. It was the creature, the one that had been hunting me. I backed away, my feet slipping on the slick stone. The whispers surged, a wave of sound crashing against my mind, drowning out everything else. The thing was getting closer, its long arms reaching for me, its glowing eyes burning with an unholy light. I ran. I ran blindly, my breath coming in desperate gasps, my legs burning with exhaustion. The tunnel twisted, the walls bending and warping as if the entire place were alive. Every corner I turned, every step I took, it was still there, always just behind me, always reaching out. And then, I saw it. A figure, standing in the darkness ahead of me. A silhouette against the dim light. It was tall, unearthingly still, and I knew it was waiting for me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The creature behind me was too close. The door was too far. There was nowhere to go. The figure moved. Slowly at first, its form shifting in and out of the light. But it wasn't walking. No, it was floating. Gliding toward me, its presence heavy and suffocating, like a storm on the horizon. I didn't know if it was human. I didn't know if it was real. But it was coming. And as it moved closer, a voice, soft, cold, and ancient, reached out from the darkness. "You've come so far, but you won't leave." The last thing I remembered before the darkness consumed me was the feeling of something icy cold wrapping around my neck. A tightening, squeezing, suffocating. And then, nothing. When I opened my eyes, the world was different. The suffocating darkness had lifted, but not in the way I had hoped. Instead, I found myself standing in an endless expanse, a place both familiar and alien. The air was thick, unnatural, and as I looked around, I realized that I was no longer in the tunnels. The walls had disappeared, replaced by a vast, empty field stretching endlessly in all directions. It was as if the boundaries of reality had bent and twisted, pulling me into some otherworldly dimension. The ground beneath my feet was soft, almost marshy, and the sky above was a pale, sickly yellow, like the light of a dying sun. Everything was still. The silence was oppressive, suffocating, and the weight of it pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. But it wasn't the silence that made my skin crawl. It was the sound, the distant, echoing laughter. That high-pitched, mocking giggle that had followed me throughout the tunnels. It came from everywhere, reverberating in my head, bouncing off the walls of my mind like a cruel reminder of everything that had led me here. I looked down at myself, expecting to find dirt and grime from the tunnels. But my hands were clean. My clothes were pristine, as if nothing had ever happened. But the feeling of something wrong lingered. It clung to me, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. How did I get here? I tried to take a step forward, but my legs felt heavy, like they were moving through thick, invisible sludge. The ground beneath me trembled, a low hum vibrating through my bones. I looked around, my heart racing in my chest. There was something else, something moving in the distance. It was hard to make out at first, just a shape, flickering in and out of view. Then, it stopped. I froze. It was a figure. Tall, like the one I had seen before. But this time, it was different. Its form seemed to ripple, like smoke in the wind, constantly shifting, never settling into something solid. It was there one moment and gone the next, as if playing a game with me, taunting me. And then, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was cold, detached, as though it came from some faraway place, a voice not bound by time or space. My blood ran cold as I realized it was speaking to me, as if it had been waiting for my arrival all along. "It's too late now," the voice continued, echoing in my mind. "There's no going back." I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. I couldn't move. The laughter grew louder, more insistent, like a chorus of voices all around me, pressing in from every direction. Was I dreaming? I thought. Was this all in my mind? But no, the pain in my chest was too real, the sense of dread too sharp. The air around me felt thick, heavy, as though it was alive and suffocating me. It was as if the entire place, this twisted realm, was waiting to consume me. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. It didn't matter. The figure before me was moving again, slowly, deliberately, its form coming into sharper focus with every passing second. It was tall, yes, but there was something more to it. Its body was made of shadows, rippling, ever-changing, and in its hands, it held something small, something familiar. A doll. The doll's eyes gleamed in the dim light, its porcelain face twisted in an expression of pure malice. And then, the figure spoke again, its voice now a whisper that sent chills crawling up my spine. It never ends. The figure took a step closer, and with each movement, the air grew colder. I could feel the darkness pressing in, wrapping around me like a noose. I couldn't escape. There was nowhere to run. The whispers from the dolls were everywhere, filling my mind, each voice distinct, yet all the same. It's time, the figure said, its voice now a command, a final warning. The ground beneath me shifted again. I stumbled forward, my hands reaching out for something, anything, to hold on to. But the field was empty. I was alone, trapped in this place with no escape. And then, as if in answer to my thoughts, the ground cracked open. A deep, cavernous chasm appeared before me, wide and dark, stretching endlessly into the void. It was a maw, a gaping wound in reality, and I could hear something monstrous moving within it, something too horrible to comprehend. I backed away, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The laughter reached a crescendo. The dolls, those accursed dolls, were everywhere now, their eyes fixed on me, their faces frozen in silent screams. They watched as I stumbled back, inch by inch, until there was nowhere left to go. The void yawned before me, its pull irresistible. It's your turn, the voice said, softer now, almost gentle. I turned to run, but it was too late. The darkness swallowed me whole. The last thing I heard was the sound of that haunting laughter, echoing in my mind as I fell into the abyss. And then, nothing. The Tree of Voices in Maryland. It was late in the autumn when I first heard the stories. The locals of Maryland spoke in hushed tones about the old tree deep in the woods, a place few dared to go, even fewer ever returned from. They called it the Tree of Voices. I didn't believe them at first. Who would? How could something as simple as a tree cause so much fear? I had grown up in these woods, wandering through them as a child without a care in the world. But something about this tree, it felt different. It was always there, standing tall on the edge of the forest, with branches that seemed to sway even when the air was still. People said the tree gathered the voices of those who got lost in the woods, and that those voices would whisper to anyone who came close. I was skeptical, but a part of me was drawn to it. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I decided to visit it. My footsteps were quiet on the leaf-strewn path, and the world around me seemed oddly silent. No chirping birds, no rustling leaves in the wind, only the faint rustle of my boots. I'd come to see if the stories were true. If it was just a tree, like any other, or something far more sinister. The path leading to it felt longer than I remembered. The trees, once familiar and comforting, seemed to stretch taller and closer, their twisted branches almost blocking out the last remnants of daylight. As I drew nearer to the tree, an unsettling feeling washed over me. The air grew colder, and the quiet became heavy, almost suffocating. I could hear nothing, yet the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Was it the wind? It was hard to tell. My breath seemed to freeze in the air as I stood before the tree. Its bark was dark and gnarled, its trunk wide and ancient, the kind of tree that seemed to have lived longer than any other around it. I reached out a hand to touch it. My fingers brushed the rough bark, and as I did, a strange shiver ran through me. A voice, faint at first, drifted through the air, almost imperceptible. "Help me." I froze. My heart raced, and I quickly withdrew my hand. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind, or perhaps my mind playing tricks. But the whisper lingered in my mind, refusing to let go. The words repeated, like a faint murmur from far away, as if the tree itself was speaking. "Help me, please." I turned to leave, my pulse quickening, but then something else happened. A second voice, distant but clearer, joined the first. It wasn't just one voice anymore. The air seemed to thicken with whispers, all around me. I couldn't tell where they were coming from. The voices swirled in the air like a chorus of lost souls, each one more desperate than the last. They didn't seem to belong to anyone I knew. These were people I could recognize. They were strangers, their cries echoing through the woods. "Please, come back, don't leave me." My heart pounded as the voices continued to rise, overlapping each other, until they became a cacophony of pleading, terrified whispers. The sound was deafening, so loud it felt as though the forest itself was closing in on me. I could hardly breathe, my head spinning as the fear grew inside me. I had to get away. The voices seemed to call to me, urging me to stay, to listen, to understand. But I knew better than to listen. I turned and bolted down the path, my feet stumbling over the uneven ground, the air growing colder with each step. I didn't dare look back. But even as I ran, I could still hear the whispers. "Help me, don't leave me alone, come back." It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the trees. There was something alive in those voices, something watching, waiting for the next lost soul to find its way to the tree of voices. I had made it back to the edge of the forest, my chest heaving, my breath ragged. I felt safe, but only for a moment. The whispers didn't fade away. They followed me, echoed in my mind. Something had changed. Something inside me shifted, like the very ground beneath my feet was unstable, as though the tree's whispers had left a mark on my soul. I didn't know how, but I was sure of one thing now: the tree was alive. And it was hungry for more. As the evening sky darkened and the forest fell silent once more, I stood there, my mind racing with a new, terrifying thought. It wasn't just the tree that collected voices. It was the forest itself. And it was waiting for me to return. The days after my visit to the tree felt wrong. It wasn't just the memory of the whispers that haunted me, though that was bad enough. It was the feeling that something had changed within me. The voices had followed me, whispering in my ear, calling me. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear them. Faint at first, barely audible, but always there, growing louder, as if they were drawing closer. At night, I would lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that it had all been some kind of hallucination. That I had just imagined the voices, a trick of my mind. But deep down, I knew it wasn't true. The whispers were real. And they were getting stronger. I had to know more. I had to understand what was happening to me, what that tree really was. So, despite the growing sense of dread, I returned to the forest. The sun had barely risen, and the world was still covered in the quiet hush of early morning. I walked the familiar path to the tree, my every step echoing through the thickening fog. The trees were different today, as if they were watching me, waiting for me to come closer. The silence was unnerving, a heavy stillness pressing down on me like an invisible weight. When I reached the tree, I didn't hesitate. I approached it slowly, feeling the cold air press against my skin. The whispers began again, this time more insistent, like 1,000 voices calling my name, urging me to listen, to stay, to understand. I reached out and placed my hand on the rough bark, the sensation sending a jolt through me. The moment I touched it, the ground beneath my feet seemed to tremble. The whispers intensified, and I could hear them clearly now, their words not just a murmur but a chorus of voices that mixed together in a terrifying symphony. "Come closer, stay with us." I pulled my hand away, heart pounding in my chest. But the voices didn't stop. They swirled around me, louder now, desperate, as though the tree was pulling them from the very air. They came from everywhere, the ground, the trees, the wind itself. I stumbled back, trying to retreat, but my legs felt heavy, like they were sinking into the earth. "Please, don't leave." I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. I could barely breathe. It was as if the very air had turned to stone, choking me, holding me in place. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, pressing against my skull. Suddenly, I heard a loud crack, sharp and echoing, like the snap of a branch. My head whipped toward the source of the sound. Something was moving in the trees. A shadow, no, a figure, moved swiftly, its shape barely distinguishable in the dim light. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel it watching me. The air around me grew colder, and the whispers shifted. They turned from pleading to something darker, something more sinister. "Stay." I turned and ran. My feet barely touched the ground as I sprinted down the path, the whispers still chasing me, following me with every step. I could hear the wind, or maybe it was something else, something not quite human, but I didn't dare look back. The forest felt endless. The trees seemed to stretch on forever, their twisted branches reaching toward me like fingers. My mind raced, trying to find a reason, trying to explain what was happening, but the truth was clear now. This wasn't just a tree. This was something ancient, something powerful. Something that had been waiting for me. Waiting for anyone. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the forest, the daylight barely breaking through the trees. My chest was tight, my breath ragged. I turned back once more, expecting to see nothing but the still, silent woods behind me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The whispers were gone, but the weight of them hung in the air like a shadow. I was safe, for now. But I knew that I wouldn't be for long. I thought about the voices again, and the strange figure I had seen in the trees. What was it? And why had it felt so familiar? It wasn't until later that night, as I lay in bed once more, trying to block out the constant hum in my head, that I realized something else. The figure hadn't just been moving through the trees. It had been coming toward me. The weeks following my second visit to the tree were a blur of unease and exhaustion. Every night, I'd lie awake in my bed, my eyes wide open, straining to hear the whispers. They were always there, just on the edge of my consciousness, a constant hum that seemed to fill every corner of my mind. I had tried to tell myself that I was just imagining it, that it was some side effect of my fear, but deep down, I knew the truth. The tree was calling to me. The strange figure I had seen in the forest that day had haunted my thoughts. Its shape, its presence, had stayed with me, an image I couldn't shake. It hadn't been a person. It had been something else. Something that didn't belong. I wasn't sure what it was, but I knew it wasn't natural. I couldn't stop thinking about it, about the way it had moved with such purpose, as if it had been waiting for me. I had to know more. I had to understand what was really happening in that forest. So, on a cold morning in early winter, I made my decision. I would go back. I would face whatever waited for me there. The voices couldn't keep me away. Not anymore. I packed a small bag, grabbed a flashlight, and set off for the woods before the sun had fully risen. The cold air nipped at my skin, and the trees loomed like silent sentinels in the gray light of dawn. As I walked, the silence around me felt heavy, thick, like a blanket pressed too tightly against my chest. The closer I got to the tree, the more I felt it, a pressure building in the air, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I stepped onto the familiar path, each footfall echoing in the stillness, my heartbeat quickening. When I reached the tree, I stopped. There it was, the gnarled trunk rising before me, its twisted branches hanging like skeletal arms. It looked even more foreboding now, darker in the low light, as though it had grown since the last time I was here. I could hear the faintest sound, almost like a sigh, drifting on the wind. It was a voice. A soft, broken voice, like someone calling for help from far away. Help me. The words were faint, but they were there, tugging at something deep inside me. I approached the tree slowly, feeling the familiar coldness in the air. I couldn't help myself. I had to know what was happening, why the tree was so alive. I reached out again, my fingers trembling as they brushed the rough bark. As soon as my hand touched it, the ground beneath me shifted. The world tilted, and I felt a rush of dizziness, as though I were falling, as though the earth itself was pulling me down. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of desperate, pleading voices surrounding me, pressing on me from all sides. I pulled my hand away, stumbling back, but it was too late. The air around me was thick with something else now, a presence, something moving, something alive. The figure I had seen weeks ago stepped out from the shadows of the trees. It wasn't a person. It was too tall, too thin, its limbs twisted unnaturally, like branches. Its face was obscured in shadow, but its eyes glowed with an eerie light, reflecting the faint glow of the dying day. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The figure stepped closer, its movements jerky, like a puppet on strings. It didn't speak, but its gaze was enough. I could feel it, the weight of its stare, pressing down on me, filling me with a cold dread that sunk deep into my bones. The whispers grew louder, and I realized with growing horror that they were coming from the figure. The voices, they weren't just in the air. They were coming from it, from the darkness that clung to its form, from the very space it occupied. It was the tree. The figure was the tree, or at least, it was part of it. The tree had been calling to me, and now I understood why. It wasn't just a tree, it was a vessel. A conduit for the voices of the lost, and it had been feeding on them for years. Stay, the figure rasped, its voice a hollow echo that sent chills through my entire body. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. It was like it was pulling me toward it, toward the tree, toward the voices. Then, a thought, one final thought, flashed through my mind. If the tree was feeding on the lost, what would happen to me if I stayed? And in that moment, I understood. The tree wasn't just drawing me in. It was claiming me. The voices were its bait, and once it had you, once it had your fear, it would never let you go. With all the strength I had left, I broke free from the trance, forcing my legs to move. I stumbled back, tripping over the roots of the tree, but I didn't stop. I didn't dare stop. The figure didn't chase me. It didn't need to. It already had what it wanted. I ran, faster than I had ever run before, until the forest was behind me, until I was back at the edge, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers followed me, louder now, louder than ever, like they were inside my head, crawling through my thoughts. They wouldn't stop. They wouldn't leave me alone. I was free, but I wasn't safe. And I knew, deep down, that the tree would never stop calling me. It would never stop trying to claim me. And I would never be able to escape it. The days after I fled the forest felt surreal. My life returned to a strange semblance of normalcy, though it was anything but. I went through the motions, work, errands, meals, each day a blur, as though I were moving through life in a fog. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the haunting whispers. They never stopped. They had become a constant presence, a background noise that followed me wherever I went. In the quietest moments, I would hear them, distant and faint, but always there. Sometimes they were calling my name. Other times, they were just fragmented voices, echoing through my thoughts, muttering incoherent words. It was as if they were waiting for me to return. But I knew I couldn't go back. The tree was out there, and the figure, the thing I had seen, was waiting. It was feeding off my fear, and it was relentless. I tried to tell myself that it was all in my head, that I could ignore it, that I could move on. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure's glowing eyes staring at me from the shadows. I stopped sleeping. I couldn't bear to close my eyes, not when the whispers were so close. They filled my nights with restless tossing and turning. I could feel the pull, the magnetic draw to the forest, urging me to return, urging me to surrender. It was as if I had become part of the tree, as if the voices had attached themselves to me, using me as their conduit. Then, one evening, it happened. I was walking home from the grocery store when I felt it, like a sudden chill sweeping over me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I froze in place. I looked around, trying to find the source of the cold, but the streets were empty. No one else was around. That's when I heard it, the whisper, so faint I could barely make it out. But I knew it was calling to me. Come back. It was the same voice I had heard in the forest, the same broken, pleading voice. It wasn't just in my head this time. It was real, just as real as the cold that was wrapping itself around me. The forest was calling. The tree was calling. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, torn between running and returning. I knew it was dangerous. I knew it was a trap. But something inside me, something dark and desperate, urged me to go. I had to know the truth. I had to face whatever it was that had claimed me. Before I could stop myself, my legs were moving, walking toward the edge of the woods. It was like my body was on autopilot, and I was powerless to stop it. The further I went, the louder the whispers became. They grew clearer, more distinct, and more urgent. By the time I reached the tree, the forest was suffocating. The air was thick, heavy, and the weight of it pressed down on my chest. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like the forest was alive, watching me, waiting for me to step into its grasp. The tree stood before me, its twisted branches reaching into the sky like skeletal arms, its bark darker, as if it had absorbed the darkness of the forest itself. The figure was there, too, standing in the shadows, its glowing eyes fixed on me. It didn't move, didn't speak. It simply watched, its presence like an anchor, pulling me toward it. I didn't hesitate this time. I walked straight toward the tree, my hand reaching out to touch the bark. As soon as my fingers made contact, the world seemed to snap. Everything around me blurred, spinning out of focus, and I felt like I was falling. But this time, I didn't panic. I didn't fight it. The whispers had become voices, clear, distinct, calling to me from everywhere. They weren't just lost souls. They were the voices of people who had come before me, people who had made the same mistake, who had been drawn into the tree's grip and never escaped. Stay with us. And then, something inside me cracked. I realized it wasn't just the tree that had been feeding off my fear. It was feeding off my very soul. I was becoming one of them. I closed my eyes, trying to shut out the overwhelming chorus of voices. But the more I resisted, the louder they became. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the world snapped back into place. I was standing in the forest, alone. The tree loomed over me, silent now. The figure was gone. But the whispers, those voices, still echoed in my mind. I turned and ran, not looking back, not daring to. I didn't know how long I ran, but eventually, I found myself back at the edge of the woods, gasping for breath, my legs weak and trembling beneath me. I had escaped, for now. But the tree was still there. The voices were still inside my head, growing louder with every passing moment. I knew one thing for certain, I could never escape. I was already lost. And sooner or later, the forest would come for me again. I had barely slept since that night in the forest. The walls of my apartment felt thinner, like the entire world was closing in on me. The whispers, once faint and distant, now filled my mind constantly, growing louder with each passing hour. It was as if the tree, the figure, and the voices were inside me, a part of me I couldn't escape. I had tried everything. I spoke to friends, even tried therapy, but no one understood. How could they? How could anyone understand that the whispers weren't just thoughts in my head, but real, tangible voices? How could they understand that something was hunting me, waiting for me to slip up, to give in? The tree was still out there, calling me. I couldn't outrun it. I couldn't hide from it. That evening, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the city streets, the whispers began to change. They no longer called me to return to the forest. No, this time, they were more urgent, more desperate. Come back. We are waiting. It was no longer a mere suggestion. It was a command, an order. I had become part of the tree's twisted cycle, and the voices were now its anchors, pulling me back to the place where it all began. I knew then that I had no choice. I had to return. If I didn't, I would be lost forever. The whispers would consume me, break me from the inside out. The city felt distant as I walked, the streets now foreign and cold. The familiar hum of traffic was replaced by the faint, eerie sound of the wind whispering through the trees. It was calling me, guiding me toward the edge of the woods. As I approached the forest, the air grew colder. I could see my breath forming in front of me, like smoke escaping from my lungs. I walked deeper into the trees, each step heavier than the last. The whispers were louder now, clearer. I was close. I could feel it. The tree stood before me again, its twisted branches stretching toward the sky like fingers reaching out to grab me. Its bark was darker, more gnarled than I remembered. It seemed hungrier. And then I saw it. The figure. It was waiting for me, its form like a shadow stretched across the forest floor. Its glowing eyes fixed on me, its silent presence demanding my attention. I could feel its desire, its need to pull me into the depths of the forest. I took a step forward. The tree's voice echoed in my mind. You are ours now. I tried to resist, but the pull was too strong. I felt my legs move on their own, carrying me toward the tree. The whispers were a constant, pressing force, like they were pushing me forward, suffocating me with their demands. When I reached the tree, I placed my hand on the bark, just as I had done before. This time, it didn't feel cold. It felt warm, alive, as if the tree itself was breathing. The ground beneath me trembled, and I could feel the air shift, swirling around me, pulling me into its grasp. Stay with us. I closed my eyes, and in that moment, I understood. The tree wasn't just feeding on fear, it was feeding on everything. It was feeding on memories, on souls, on time itself. Each voice trapped inside it was part of a never-ending cycle, a cycle that had no beginning or end. The tree was a prison, and I was its latest inmate. But I wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. I pulled my hand away from the bark, staggering back. The whispers grew louder, angry, furious. The figure moved, its limbs jerking and twitching as it stepped toward me, but I didn't stop. I ran. I ran through the trees, my breath ragged in my chest, my heart pounding in my ears. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape. The whispers were still there, following me, growing louder with each step. And then I heard it, clear as day. We are always here. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart skipping a beat. The voice was no longer distant. It was right beside me. I turned around, but the forest was empty. The trees stood silently in the dim light, their branches swaying in the wind. But I could feel it. The tree was still there, watching me. The whispers, the figure, everything was still here, in the shadows, waiting. It wasn't over. It would never be over. I was trapped. I was already lost. And the tree had claimed me. Doll Fields in Arkansas. Have you ever wandered through a place that felt wrong the moment you stepped foot? Not in a way you could explain, but in a way that crawled under your skin, gnawed at the edges of your thoughts? That's how it was when I first heard about the Doll Fields in Arkansas. The locals called it the Doll Patch, but whatever they called it, I could never quite shake the feeling that something sinister was lurking just beneath the surface of those withered trees. I was new to Arkansas. The small town I had moved to was nestled deep in the forest, miles from the nearest city. It had that sort of charm, with rolling hills and ancient woods that whispered with the breeze. It should have been peaceful, quiet even. But the Doll Fields changed that for me. I first heard about the field on a quiet afternoon when I stopped into the town's only gas station to ask for directions. The old man behind the counter, a grizzled figure with a thick white beard, eyed me with a wariness that made my skin crawl. "Don't go there," he said, his voice low, as if speaking the words too loudly might summon something. "No good comes from them fields. Them dolls, they ain't right." At the time, I laughed it off. The thought of a field full of old dolls hanging from trees sounded more like an urban legend than anything real. But something in the way he said it, something in the set of his jaw, made me curious. "Why?" I asked, trying to keep the nervous laugh out of my voice. "Don't ask questions you don't want to know the answers to," he muttered, then quickly changed the subject, as though he had said too much already. I left the gas station with an uneasy feeling in my chest, the old man's words echoing in my mind. But I didn't think much more of it. I chalked it up to small-town superstition and decided to take a look for myself. I was just passing through, after all, and the strange curiosity that tugged at me was hard to ignore. The next day, I drove out of town. It was a warm afternoon, the sun high and bright, and the air smelled faintly of pine and earth. I followed the narrow dirt roads, winding deeper into the woods. The trees here were thick and the shadows they cast long and stretching. Eventually, I came to the edge of the field. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Just rows of trees, their branches twisted and gnarled with age. But as I stepped out of my car, I noticed something strange in the distance. Hanging from the limbs of the trees were hundreds of old, battered dolls, some with clothes torn and faded, others missing eyes, their faces painted in cracked and peeling colors. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves in a soft whisper that sounded almost like voices. I shivered, but I told myself it was nothing, just the wind. Still, something about the way the dolls swayed in the breeze made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I walked closer, drawn by a strange sense of dread and fascination. The dolls seemed to be watching me, their empty eyes staring out from beneath the trees. Some hung from their arms, others by their legs, a few even draped over the branches like grotesque ornaments. It was an eerie sight, one that made my stomach twist. And then, as I stood there, taking in the bizarre scene, I heard it, a soft giggle, high-pitched and childlike, carried on the wind. It made my heart skip a beat. I froze. The laughter was faint at first, like the sound of children playing far away. But as the seconds passed, it grew louder, closer, until it seemed to come from all around me. The wind had stopped, leaving an oppressive stillness in the air, and yet the laughter continued, echoing through the trees. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. There was no one there. Not a soul. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. There was no reply. The laughter didn't stop. It was joined by a whisper, low and soft, as if someone was speaking just behind me, too close for comfort. The words were indistinct, too faint to catch, but the feeling it left was unmistakable. I was being watched. I took a step back, my eyes darting around the field, my pulse racing. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks on me, that I had to leave before I let my imagination run wild. But my feet wouldn't move. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and the dolls were staring at me. I could feel their gaze, cold and unblinking. The giggle returned, louder this time, and closer. It was accompanied by another whisper, this time clearer, almost as though someone, or something, was speaking directly into my ear. "Go away." I didn't need to hear any more. My body finally obeyed, and I turned to run, my heart pounding in my chest. As I stumbled back to my car, the laughter continued, following me, echoing from the trees as though mocking me. I didn't look back until I was safely in my car, speeding down the dirt road, my hands gripping the wheels so tightly my knuckles ached. But even as I drove away, I could still hear the faint giggles, fading with the distance but never truly disappearing. Something about that place, those dolls, that laughter, it felt alive. and I had the sinking feeling that the worst was yet to come. I tried to shake the feeling off, but it clung to me like a shadow. The next few days were a blur, filled with a restless unease I couldn't explain. Every time I passed the gas station, I could feel the old man's eyes on me, as if he knew what I had seen, as if he knew something worse was waiting for me. But I couldn't bring myself to ask more questions. There was a heavy silence around that place, a silence that seemed to whisper of things better left forgotten. I spent the next week avoiding the doll fields, but it wasn't easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those dolls. Their hollow eyes seemed to follow me wherever I went. And the laughter, soft at first, almost imperceptible, began to invade my dreams. It became louder, more insistent, until I could hear it even while I was wide awake. The strange thing was, I couldn't find anyone willing to talk about the doll fields. Locals changed the subject whenever I brought it up, their faces growing tense, as if they feared even the mention of it. I tried asking around again, at different places, but it was the same story: silence, avoidance, and the occasional whispered warning. By the end of the week, the tension in the town had built to a point where it felt suffocating. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think straight. The laughter echoed in my mind, growing louder, sharper. I felt like I was being pulled back to that place, like something there was waiting for me, calling me. I knew I had to go back. It felt like an obsession, a compulsion I couldn't fight. The decision was made before I could even think it through. I had to see what was happening at that field. The sun had set by the time I drove back to the doll fields. It was late, and the streets were empty. The only sounds were the hum of my car and the occasional rustling of the trees. I parked at the edge of the field, the familiar dread creeping up my spine. The wind was calm tonight, eerily still. I stepped out of the car, my breath visible in the cold night air. The moon hung low, casting an eerie glow over the field. The dolls, suspended in the trees, seemed to be waiting. Their limbs swayed gently in the breeze, their eyes fixed on me with that unsettling emptiness. And then, I heard it. The giggle. It was faint at first, almost like a whisper. But as the seconds passed, it grew louder. Closer. I turned quickly, but there was no one in sight. Only the dolls, staring down at me. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. The laughter was joined by something else. A sound, at first indistinguishable, but then clear enough that it made my blood run cold. Footsteps. Soft, slow, deliberate. But the ground beneath me was still. There was no one there. I looked around, my heart racing. The field was empty, save for the dolls. Yet the footsteps continued, getting closer. The sound seemed to be circling around me, coming from every direction. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but it was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was here with me. I backed away, my hands trembling. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. There was no response, just the creeping feeling of being surrounded. And then I saw it. At the far end of the field, a shadow moved, shifting between the trees. It was too dark to make out any details, but it was unmistakably there. A figure, tall and unnatural, blending into the darkness like it belonged to the night. The footsteps had stopped, but the feeling of being watched intensified. I wanted to run. I wanted to get back to my car, to get as far away from this place as I could. But my legs wouldn't move. It was as if some invisible force was holding me in place. The air felt thick, suffocating. The figure took a step forward, and my breath caught in my throat. Its shape flickered, like a mirage, blurring in and out of existence. The giggling grew louder, now joined by something more terrifying, a voice, barely a whisper, but so clear I could hear it in my bones. "Don't run." I couldn't move. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood frozen, watching the shadow approach. I wanted to scream, to shout for help, but my throat was tight. The voice echoed in my mind, drowning out everything else. The figure was getting closer, and I could see its outline more clearly now. It was tall, too tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that stretched at odd angles. Its head tilted in a way that made my stomach turn. And its eyes. I couldn't see them clearly, but I could feel them burning into me, watching me. The dolls were moving now, too. Their heads turned, following the figure's movements. The giggle was replaced by a chorus of whispers, too many voices to count. The dolls' eyes gleamed in the moonlight, their painted faces twisted in expressions I couldn't quite make sense of. But they were all watching me. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, the figure stopped. The whispers faded into silence. The dolls fell still, their eyes returning to their original blank stares. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. "Leave," the voice whispered, too close now, right behind me. Without thinking, I spun around, my pulse racing. But there was no one there. Only the field, empty once again. The shadow had vanished, and the dolls hung motionless in the trees. I didn't wait for anything else. I turned and ran, my heart hammering in my chest, my feet stumbling over the uneven ground. The laughter started again, faint at first, then building until it was deafening. It was everywhere, circling, closing in on me. I barely reached my car before it felt like something was going to drag me back into the field, into the darkness. I drove away faster than I ever had before, the sound of the laughter still ringing in my ears. But it wasn't just the laughter that haunted me. It was the eyes that never stopped watching me. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadow in the field, the eyes that followed me, and the dolls that seemed to move while I wasn't looking. The fear, once sharp and immediate, had now turned into something deeper, a gnawing unease that refused to leave me. I tried to tell myself that I had imagined it all, that the figures in the field were just tricks of the moonlight, that the laughter was just the wind. But I knew, deep down, that I was lying to myself. The next day, I went back to the town's only diner, hoping for a bit of comfort, maybe some answers. The waitress, an older woman with gray hair and a tired smile, greeted me quietly, as if she had been expecting me. Her eyes lingered on me for just a second too long before she spoke. "You're back," she said softly, almost knowingly. "Yeah," I replied, sitting down at a booth by the window. I have to ask you something." She didn't seem surprised. "I know what you're going to ask," she said, her voice low. "You went to the doll fields, didn't you?" I nodded, the weight of it making my chest tighten. What is that place? What's going on there?" She sighed, wiping down the counter in front of her. "You should have stayed away," she said, shaking her head. "People around here know better than to go near those fields. That place, it's cursed. Always has been." I leaned forward, my heart racing. But what happened? Why are there dolls? Why does it feel like something's there? Something watching? The waitress paused, her hand shaking slightly as she set down a cup of coffee. "You've heard the stories, I'm sure." About the old family who used to live out there. The one with the little girl, the one who was never found. The dolls you saw, they're not just dolls. They're something else. The souls of those who've been taken. I felt the blood drain from my face. Taken? Long ago, there was a girl, only a child. She went missing, just like all the others before her. They say she wandered too close to the fields, to the trees. She never came back. The dolls, they were hers. Her family, in their grief, thought if they left them in the trees, the child's spirit would find peace. But instead, it called something darker. Something darker? I whispered, barely able to speak. She nodded, her face growing pale. The dolls, they weren't meant to be there. They're vessels. The thing that took her, it's still there. And it's still looking for more. I felt a cold chill crawl down my spine. The pieces were falling into place, but I wasn't sure I wanted to know the full story. What do you mean, looking for more? Her eyes dropped to her hands. The thing that haunts the field, it doesn't just want the souls of children. It wants anyone. If you go back, if you're not careful, it will take you too. I felt a knot form in my stomach. So what should I do? How do I stop it? She shook her head slowly. You can't. You can only run. The waitress didn't say anything else. I sat there, staring at my coffee, feeling the weight of her words settle in. I wanted to believe it was all nonsense, that it was just a local legend. But the laughter, the footsteps, the figure, I knew now that it was real. And the worst part? I couldn't escape it. That night, I tried to stay away. I told myself that I wouldn't go back to the field. But the fear, the obsession, pulled me back like a magnetic force. I tried to ignore it. I tried to convince myself that I had done enough, that I knew enough to stay away. But when the darkness fell, I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I found myself driving back to the doll fields again. The town was quiet as I passed through, but the weight in the air felt thick, as though even the land itself was holding its breath. The road twisted and turned, leading me to the familiar dirt path that led into the heart of the field. The moon was full tonight, casting a silvery glow across the barren land. I parked the car and stepped out, the chill of the night air hitting me like a slap. My feet felt heavy, like they didn't want to move. The sound of my breath was the only thing I could hear, until, in the distance, I heard it again. The laughter. It was faint at first, as if it was coming from a great distance. But it grew, slowly, building and echoing through the trees. The sound sent a shiver down my spine, a primal fear crawling up from the depths of my gut. I stood there, frozen, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I turned my head slowly, and I saw them. The dolls. They were swaying in the trees, their eyes glinting in the moonlight. Their once dull faces now seemed to be alive with movement. And then I heard it again, the footsteps. Closer this time. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, my mind racing with thoughts of escape. But no matter how hard I tried, my legs wouldn't move. The air felt thick, suffocating. And the laughter, it was so much louder now, surrounding me, deafening. And then, I saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the trees. The same tall shadow from before. It stood still, motionless, its eyes burning through the darkness. But this time, I didn't feel that same pull. I didn't feel the compulsion to stay. Instead, I felt something else. I felt a sudden, overwhelming need to run. I didn't even think. I turned and sprinted back to the car, my heart pounding in my chest, the sound of the footsteps following me. I reached the car, fumbled for the keys, and slammed the door shut behind me. The laughter was still there, still echoing through the night as I sped away from the field. But as I drove away, something lingered in the air. A presence. Something that had been following me even before I stepped into the dull fields. Something that would never let me go. And in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't escaped at all. The dolls were still out there, watching, waiting. I didn't sleep much that night. The darkness of the field, the eyes that seemed to follow me even as I drove away, haunted me. I kept replaying the sound of the laughter, the footsteps, and that unblinking figure standing just beyond the trees. It wasn't just the fear that gripped me, but a feeling of being pursued, of being watched, even in the safety of my own room. The next morning, I packed up, intending to leave. But as I gathered my things, I felt a pull, a strange, inexplicable need to return. I tried to fight it, but the thought kept creeping back into my mind, urging me to go back to the field, to find out more, to face whatever it was that had started this nightmare. By mid-morning, I was standing at the edge of the field again. The sun was high, casting harsh shadows across the land, but it didn't feel like a place of light. The air was still heavy, and even the chirping of birds seemed distant, muffled. I parked my car at the edge of the dirt road, the same path I had walked the night before. As I stepped out, I could feel the unease pressing against me, heavier than before. It was like something was wrong with the very earth here. I walked forward cautiously, my eyes scanning the field. Nothing seemed out of place at first. The dolls were still hanging from the trees, their porcelain faces cracked and worn by time, swaying in the gentle breeze. But then, as I ventured deeper, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. There were new dolls. Not just the old, withered ones, but fresh ones, bright, new, their faces smooth and unmarked. They hung from the same trees, their limbs swaying ever so slightly as though they were alive. And there were more. Too many more. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. A sudden chill ran down my spine. How had these dolls appeared? I didn't remember seeing them the night before. As I examined them, I noticed something strange. Their eyes were different from the others, darker, deeper, as though they held a secret. I could almost feel them watching me, analyzing me. My breath quickened as I took a step back. That's when I heard it again. The laughter. This time, it was louder, closer, and unmistakably coming from behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing. The field was empty, no figures, no shadows, just the trees and the dolls. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The sound of footsteps came next, deliberate and slow, as if something was walking toward me through the grass. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaking. No answer. Just the sound of the footsteps getting closer. I turned to leave, panic rising, but my feet felt like they were stuck to the ground. It was as though the very air had thickened, suffocating me. I tried again to move, but I couldn't. And then, I saw it. A figure emerging from the trees. Tall, shadowy, its shape not quite right, like it was made of darkness itself. Its eyes gleamed in the shadows, and I felt that same terror I had felt the night before. It was watching me. Waiting. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My body froze, paralyzed by fear. The laughter returned, louder this time, as if the field itself was alive with it. Suddenly, the figure moved. Fast. In the blink of an eye, it was right in front of me. I gasped, stumbling backward, but my legs refused to obey. The figure loomed over me, its presence suffocating. I could feel its coldness, a deep, unnatural cold that chilled me to my very bones. Its face was a blur, a shifting mass of darkness, but its eyes, those glowing, burning eyes, pierced through the shadows. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything. But all I could do was stand there, frozen, trapped in its gaze. And then it spoke. A whisper, a voice that slithered into my mind, barely audible but unmistakable. You shouldn't have come back. The words crawled under my skin, sending a shock of terror through me. It knew. It knew why I was here. I tried to gather enough strength to break free, but my body felt heavier with each passing second. The laughter grew louder, more frantic, as though the dolls themselves were laughing, mocking me. The air around me felt thick, like the ground itself was closing in. Without warning, the figure reached out, its cold, shadowy hand brushing against my arm. The touch burned, a searing pain that shot through my skin, and in that moment, I knew there was no escape. As the figure's hand tightened around my wrist, I felt a rush of coldness flood my chest. My vision blurred, and the world around me seemed to distort. I could hear the sound of my own heartbeat, each beat slowing, feeding into the sound of the laughter. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure released me. I stumbled back, my body trembling from the shock. The laughter ceased. The footsteps stopped. The figure was gone. I was alone again. But not really. I looked around the field, the dolls now swaying more violently in the wind. They were everywhere, and I knew, somehow, that they had seen me. They knew what I had done. I ran. I didn't think. I didn't look back. I just ran, desperate to escape, my lungs burning with each step. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I went, the feeling never left. The dolls were still out there, watching, waiting. And the thing that had followed me? It wasn't done with me yet. I didn't stop running until my legs felt like they were going to give out, and even then, I kept pushing forward. The wind whipped against my face, the trees behind me blurring into a swirling mass of shapes, but I couldn't escape the feeling that something was following me, closer than I dared to admit. When I finally reached my car, I slammed the door shut, my hands trembling as I fumbled to start the engine. The sound of the engine roaring to life was the only thing that kept me grounded for a moment. I drove away, my eyes flicking nervously to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing behind me, watching me with those eyes that burned into my soul. But nothing. The road was empty. I thought, perhaps, that I was safe, that whatever had happened was behind me, that I had escaped. But when I got home, I realized that the terror I had left in that field had followed me back. It was in the silence that greeted me as I stepped inside. The house felt too still, too quiet. The soft creak of the floorboards under my feet seemed too loud, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Waiting for me. I made my way to the living room, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. But as soon as I stepped inside, my blood ran cold. The dolls. They were there. On the sofa. On the mantel. On the floor. Everywhere I looked, those same old dolls I had seen in the field were staring back at me with their empty eyes. Their cracked faces. Their lifeless gazes. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. This couldn't be real. I hadn't brought them back with me. Had I? But then, I noticed something that made my stomach churn. Their eyes. They were different. They weren't just staring, no. They were watching me, blinking. Their heads moved, ever so slightly, as if they were tracking my every movement. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt like lead. I couldn't look away from those dolls, those eyes that seemed to see right through me, that seemed to know my every fear. I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of the mind, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I had never been more certain of anything in my life. I wasn't alone. I turned to the door, desperate to escape. But as my hand gripped the doorknob, I felt a sudden coldness seep into my skin. A chill so deep it felt as if my very bones had frozen. And then I heard it. That laugh again. Faint at first, but growing louder. Closer. Echoing in my mind, just like it had in the field. A laugh that wasn't just a sound, but a presence. A presence that filled the room, crawling under my skin, twisting my thoughts. I turned, and there, standing in the doorway, was the figure. The shadow. The thing that had followed me from the field. Its eyes burned into me, gleaming with that same unnatural light. It didn't need to speak. I could feel it. The hunger. The malice. And then the dolls began to move. Slowly at first, then faster, jerking as if coming to life. Their bodies twitched, limbs twitching as they clambered toward me. They weren't just dolls anymore, they were something else. Something alive. A scream tore from my throat, but the room seemed to close in on me. The figure in the doorway stepped forward, its dark form blotting out the light, and the dolls continued their crawl. The laughter grew louder, deafening, and I could feel myself slipping, losing myself to the terror that pressed in from all sides. In a blind panic, I shoved my way past the figure, but it was too late. I could feel its presence behind me. The dolls were all around me now, their cracked faces grinning, their bodies swaying like puppets in a twisted dance. The air was thick with their eyes, their laughter, their twisted, mocking voices. I ran, but no matter where I went, I couldn't escape the feeling that they were always one step ahead of me, always watching, always waiting. The house had become their prison. I was the prisoner. And as I stumbled back toward the front door, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure. It wasn't alone anymore. Behind it, dozens of dolls stood in the doorway. Their eyes glowed, their bodies shifting, twisting, becoming more than I could comprehend. The figure, now towering over me, raised a hand. Its fingers elongated, gnarled like the branches of a tree. "You shouldn't have come back," it whispered again. The words slid into my mind like poison, and I felt my body growing numb. Then the door slammed shut behind me, and the house was silent again. But it wasn't over. It never would be. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.